Hey everyone, so I'll make this intro quick. I am trying to watch every film ever nominated for any Oscar ever, except documentaries and shorts, and you can probably already work out that I've decided to let you guys know what I thought of each movie, so that's what I'll be doing. Specifically, what I've been doing this year, and also last year, is reviewing all the films from the year of the video, and then working backwards from there, but also forwards from the first Oscar. So this year I'm looking at the 95th, the 2nd, and the 98th Academy Awards. I'll link to last year so you can also check out the reviews from the first time I did this. One slight difference this time is that previously I had aspirations of talking about big franchises in other contexts, so I didn't review big franchise movies like those from the MCU, Transformers, things like that. Now, I no longer have aspirations to review such films separately, so I'll review them here. Also, when possible, I will sometimes review films that were not nominated in the year I'm talking about, but were nominated in a previous year, and for which a film this year is a sequel, but not always. These will be minimally edited, and I'll just be reading from a script, so apologies if the presentation is boring, but this is just for people interested in my thoughts on these films. Thanks. Right, so first I watched All Quiet on the Western Front. This film is starting at a not insubstantial disadvantage because I really like the original film. So for this film to justify its own existence, it would need to be adding some sort of substance to the original film. For the record, I haven't seen the original that recently, so I can't remember it perfectly. I do remember the war ends in that film like halfway through, and it deals with the trauma the soldiers struggle with after the war has ended, which seemed clever. In this film, it feels like they're about to do that because less than halfway through, it jumps forward a year and a half and it's already November 1918. I don't know if you guys are history buffs or not, but that's when the war ended. Pretty early in the month too. However, the final half of the film is just massively dragging out the final days of the war. This is where I'll say that if this film wasn't a remake, maybe it could have been much better. Like a film about the final week or so of World War I would genuinely be interesting. It was actually pretty cool the way the film was split between telling the story of the negotiations to end the war, while also showing the human cost of those prolonged negotiations as soldiers continue dying in battle. Like the original, this is strictly anti-war, although I'm not sure if there exists a pro-war film about World War I. Pretty difficult to depict the historical reality without making the pointless loss of life pretty evident. With this said, it's surprising how much this film departs from reality, and also just seems really overdramatic and cliche in its presentation. The big offender in this regard is the general overseeing the final assault of the movie. He's not based on a real person, but more to the point, his role in the film is just wildly ahistorical. Specifically, totally against the tide of war, with less than 15 minutes to go until the armistice enters into effect at 11 a.m, he orders a massive attack against the French. Now, it is true that soldiers were told to keep fighting until 11 a.m. so that there could be time for the message to spread around and everyone could stop fighting right at the same time. And there were some Allied assaults against the Germans because the momentum was with the Allies at the time, but the idea of this massive attack happening right before 11 a.m. is ridiculous. They literally start advancing with 15 minutes to go. So just as the attack is getting started, the ceasefire comes into effect. And rather predictably, the main character is killed seconds before the whistle blows to signal a cease to hostilities. It's just very on the nose as a tragic irony. It also felt a little formulaic and artificial, the way that we follow this friend group and we see them all just die one at a time. It makes it less spontaneous when you can catch yourself thinking, yeah, I guess they needed another death of a main character to remind us that war is bad. One of these deaths is totally undercut because he dies just before the final big push, so it's after they found out about the ceasefire, and the medic says when he dies, oh yeah, he's just really unlucky because he died right before the war ended, and yeah, that would be a tragic thing. Except for that just a few moments later, we see hundreds if not thousands of soldiers dying in this big push. So it sort of makes this death a bit redundant because it's overshadowed as some final cruel twist. Also, they don't even take saving this guy very seriously. After he's been shot, they just let some troop transports drive by with no serious effort to stop them, as if it's not a huge problem for this wounded guy to have to walk all the way back rather than getting emergency treatment as soon as possible. A few other things that felt artificial. The format of having big battle scenes, then protracted, small, quiet moments felt a little repetitive. There's this one guy who almost immediately pivots from being excited about joining the war to suddenly having a full-on breakdown, and it was disappointing to not actually see any character development from him. There's this one battle that felt almost like a video game with boss battles because of the way that the threats were introduced. Like, first of all, they defeated the infantry, and then some tanks show up and they have to fight them. And just as they've defeated that wave, then a load of flamethrowers show up and they have to enter the fire round. Having these distinct waves felt more like a video game than a tragic, gritty war story, and it's also ahistorical. Like, it is true that the first time tanks were used, they didn't have infantry support, but that's why quite quickly they worked out that tanks need infantry support, so what we see in this film of the tanks getting outmaneuvered and overrun by opposing infantry would not have been happening at this point in the war. Probably the biggest anti-war cliche I need to mention is the way they emphasize the disconnect between the wealthy generals and the suffering soldiers. A lot of this film is focused on the soldiers desperately needing food. Meanwhile, we get very subtle lines of dialogue where the generals are complaining about the fact the croissants aren't fresh. They need fresh croissants, goddamn. That just really felt like the movie slapping me in the face with its point. Anyway, I will now end with some compliments because, this film is ultimately still pretty good. It's a war film, which makes it inherently exhilarating with all the action. While I complained about it in some sense, I did like the moment where the tanks first show up and they seem like this totally alien, insurmountable force. I also enjoyed the pace of the film, and the first hour and a half flew by. It was only at the end where it started to get a little bit repetitive and overbearing with some of what it was communicating. My favourite bit of actual subtle filmmaking is when a poster one of his friends had is revealed to still be up in the trench they take at the end of the movie, and that does actually highlight the pointlessness of the war in a clever way. It makes it obvious they've done all this just to capture the very same trench they were already in when they started. But yeah, at the same time, if the film is supposed to be anti-war, it's not great that a big positive is that the war stuff is pretty exciting. That sort of defeats the point. Overall, the positives of this film don't go much beyond its competent, well-made, well-shot, good production values, standard stuff that makes a war movie good. But as for the theming and characterization, I just didn't love it, and also the fact it's a remake of a much better film bothers me. I certainly have no interest in watching it again. For me, it's a middling 6. It at least has some stuff going for it, and it's well made enough that you can easily be entertained by it, but you're also not missing out on much if you've never seen it. After this, I watched The Whale. As soon as I found out this movie was about religion, I got a bit worried, because I have an issue with Aronofsky and religion, specifically because he made this one movie called Mother, which is supposed to be a sort of religious commentary on the Bible, but it conspicuously just misunderstands a lot of really important religious ideas. I'll save that for my review of Mother. Oh wait, it wasn't nominated for any Oscars. My issue is everyone wants to fill their stories with religious commentary, but nobody actually want to study the Bible and understand the overall point of it. I was a bit concerned because there's this missionary in the film, and it's sort of implied that this religion is in some way conservative, fundamentalist, and cult-like. But then the missionary literally says his church accepts all faiths. So I was thinking, okay, are they like Unitarian Universalists? That's not exactly cult-like. It just made me feel a bit worried this film was going to try to be about the specifics of this religious organization, even though the organization seemed kind of contradictory to me. Eventually, the missionary does just casually appear to reveal that he isn't comfortable with the main character being gay, so I guess they are supposed to be a more traditional conservative church. What we're explicitly told is that Charlie's ex-boyfriend died as a result of the emotional turmoil from the conflict between his relationship with Charlie and his religious beliefs, although weirdly, they in both cases sort of avoid making it specifically about whether these characters are gay. Actually, the reason he gets excommunicated from the church is because he rejects an arranged marriage, so perhaps he'd have been in just as much trouble if he'd rejected the arranged marriage for a heterosexual relationship. And while the missionary does agree that he is disgusted by Charlie, Charlie also asks whether he's disgusted by him being so fat. So again, maybe he'd be as disgusted by a straight guy with identical vices. I'm confused. Why have this tragic gay relationship as an emotional focal point and have this whole religious element, but then have this weird, plausible deniability around this church's attitude towards gay people? It was never clear to me what Charlie's actual issue with the church is, because he seems to alternate between, on the one hand, criticizing the religion, and on the other hand, emphasizing his own awfulness. So, does he think this religious worldview is evil, or does he think he's too disgusting and wretched for this religious worldview? It can't really be both. Like, I can understand a Christian doubting their faith because how can such a wretched sinner be loved by God? And I can understand an atheist doubting God altogether because how can a good God exist in light of their moral issues with religion? But if you think both of those things, surely they cancel out. The religion is evil and corrupt, so are you. Welcome aboard. Another dud with this whole religion thing is that we find out that actually the missionary isn't really coming from the church he's claiming to represent. Wow, what a real twist. But then it turns out actually it's just that he didn't like the impersonal handing out of tracts soul-winning method of his old church, so he decided to go rogue as a door-to-door missionary. It's a bit weird this revelation feels like it's supposed to be a major twist, but it's really just a pretty minor disagreement, although exacerbated by his decision to steal money from the church when he left. And that is important as it gets to the moment where I not only thought I understood this movie, but also thought it had a really interesting message. See, Charlie has a daughter I keep accidentally calling Max because it's the same girl who plays Max in Stranger Things, and her character is very similar in this film, but actually her name is Ellie. Now, the thing is, she refuses to talk to Charlie, and she sometimes behaves cruelly to him. He also never sees her, he created her, and he desperately wants her to write something for him, because he obsessively reads what she writes, and he's even willing to save up all his money his entire life just so he can leave something for her after he's gone, because she'll be the only good thing he's done. So I was like, oh, Ellie is God. I mean, even the name works, right? God is Elohim. Especially in Mormonism, that's their main name for God the Father. And the missionary in this film and all the stuff about his church feels very similar to Mormonism, so Ellie is Elohim. And Charlie represents the devoted believer. Ellie refuses to speak to Charlie, just like God refuses to speak to believers. She behaves cruelly, just like our world can seem capricious despite a supposedly all-loving God. He created her by being her father, which works with the belief that zealots tend to be the ones who create God. He desperately wants her to write something for him and obsessively reads the essay she wrote. Believers desperately want revelation from God and are obsessed with his sacred scripture. He's willing to save up all his money so he can leave something for after he's gone, just like a religious person might ignore all the important things of this life and give up so much here because they're obsessed with the idea that after they're gone, there's something better coming. He doesn't help people in the here and now with his money that represents his materiality in this life because he's saving himself entirely for stuff that will transpire after his death. Now, I don't agree with this assessment of religion. I am a Christian myself, but I respect media that is honest about other people's opinions, even if I disagree with them, as long as it doesn't just show a total ignorance of religious teaching. I don't think this would be an ignorant assessment at all, and to be fair, even if you are religious, you still believe that most religious people are dedicating themselves to an ultimate falsehood, because most religions are exclusivist. See, Charlie is intensely optimistic throughout most of the film, despite his miserable situation. He seems to be at least a little bit in denial about how bad his life is. And here's the big moment, right? What I thought was the thematic crux, and I will present this as I interpreted it. Ellie, being cruel, seeks to ruin the life of the missionary by exposing his crimes to his church, and also exposing his contact details to the family. However, it turns out his family are ready to forgive him, and they invite him back home, so ultimately things work out for the best. He and Charlie both agree that this was Ellie intentionally doing this in order to help the missionary out. So for me, the thematic point of this was obvious. The religious zealot and the pathetic optimist are both deluding themselves into thinking that a capricious act of malice was ultimately intended for good, and this is proof of a providential divine goodness. I thought the movie was going to end on a cynical note, where it was ultimately just about a guy whose life is falling apart as he deludes himself into thinking all of it meant something and was rooted in some ultimate good that will continue beyond his life. And this actually helped, because honestly, I didn't like the character of Ellie. In general, I don't like characters who are just mean. I didn't like the character of Max in season 2 of Stranger Things for the same reason. Her whole shtick is just acting like she's too cool, nobody understands her, and she doesn't need anyone. It's not interesting to me, and that's Ellie's main thing in this film. She constantly talks about how much she hates him. She also pressures a recovering drug addict into doing drugs. Her mother, who has lived with her whole life, thinks she's literally evil. Like, at first, we thought that Charlie was kept from seeing his children because his ex-wife hates him, but it turns out that apparently it was to protect Charlie from Ellie, as her mother was worried she would kill him. This is one of those films where there are way too many angry, sad people, and it does just get a little grating after a while. But again, I thought all of this did make sense as part of a cynical story about the self-delusion that underlies a perception of benevolent divine providence in a cold, uncaring world. So here's how I was in fact wrong. Sort of. See, like I say, I thought that his love for his daughter was about loving something that isn't there. Like, another small example of this is that he convinces himself she loves poetry really because she writes a really negative series of notes, but he rejoices upon realizing the text also happens to form a haiku. But yeah, in the end it's revealed that this essay he's been obsessed with and loved was actually written by her, and when she realizes that she loves his essay, she starts crying and her heart seems to soften. There's also this incredibly cliche callback where earlier on she asked him to get up and walk towards him, but he couldn't do it because of his extreme weight. However, now in this climactic moment of emotional catharsis, he gets up and walks towards her. So the big difference here is I thought this movie was going to be a bit more cynical, and honestly, by the end, it just seemed like a pretty cliche, cheesy, emotionally manipulative story, which was a disappointment. However, upon reflection, I do second guess myself. See, at the end of the film, he is about to die due to complications from his weight. It is possible that he's actually dying here, and what he's seeing is a fantasy before his consciousness ceases. That would be in keeping with the cynical ending, and would be a lot more emotionally interesting. But I'm not sure if that lines up. I had a few other things to talk about, but honestly, I've covered the main substance of the story. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is his obsession with honesty. He loses his job as a lecturer because he sends out an aggressive message to his students telling them to just write something honest because that's all that matters rather than grades. Obviously, that would fit perfectly with the idea he's refusing to be honest with himself in his self-delusion, so maybe that is relevant. Also, he's constantly watching the Republican primaries on the news throughout the movie, and while this would be a bit cringe in terms of how lib and Reddit this would be, maybe this is also playing into the theme of dishonesty and self-destruction, as that certainly describes a lot of politics. The final thing I should say is that his relationship with his carer is a bit confusing. She's quite a major part of the film, and her brother is Charlie's deceased ex-lover, but weirdly she doesn't have that much of a role. I mean, she does a few significant things, like she seems to enable his self-destructive behavior. I could probably come up with a deeper thematic analysis of her role in the film, but I've been talking about this film for a while, so I'll leave it there. As for my opinion on this film, well, obviously everyone was so happy to see Brendan Fraser in a serious acting role because he's sort of the internet's darling. In terms of rating, it's a weird situation where I find my interpretation of the film really interesting, but I could be wildly misinterpreting it. I massively misinterpreted the movie The Brutalist by making the amateur mistake of thinking it actually had something to do with the architectural movement of brutalism. But in the case of this film, I feel like I'm quite happy to say that my interpretation lines up with the content of the film, and that makes me like it. Having said that, I think the film isn't super incredible in terms of exploration of themes. There are some limitations to it in my humble submission. I think I'm just going to give it a high 7. I don't have a huge amount of interest in watching it again, which to me is sort of the qualifier for something being an 8 out of 10. I feel a little bit mean only giving it a 7, as it did have a fair bit of emotional resonance that really made me feel something, but yeah, it was just missing that sense of everything coming together into a grander whole for me. Especially since, I feel like there probably is something in the movie that means a lot of my interpretation of it doesn't line up with the actual material. Tar is just an example of a movie that does not justify its length. I don't have an intrinsic problem with longer movies, but once you get above 2 hours and 20 minutes, I'm gonna start thinking, okay, why? Like, if a film is 4 hours, but it only achieves that which could have been achieved in 2 hours, then that's obviously a problem. It doesn't help that I watched this after The Whale, which was a much more emotional and impactful film that was only 2 hours long. And then obviously All Quiet on the Western Front was just about as long as this, 2 hours and 50 minutes, but that was an epic war drama that actually didn't feel its length at all, really. To be fair, this film also didn't feel that long. Like, the first hour actually flew by, but not because it was especially exciting, mostly just because there was so much talking it was like listening to an hour-long podcast. I generally find that films that have long dialogue-heavy scenes can go by pretty quickly, because a 10-minute conversation feels a lot shorter than 10 minutes of shorter scenes with action and lots of different visuals and settings and characters. So I wasn't exactly bored by the length, but I was aware of it. And that will impact my desire to watch this again. I probably never will, because I just have to ask, what am I supposed to be getting out of this? Because the central plot is actually incredibly simple. There's this composer, who is also a lesbian sexual predator. The fact she's a lesbian isn't like super important, I guess, but I mean, it helps clarify that while she's a woman, she isn't being predatory towards men, which would be funny, but rather women. So even though she's a woman, it's not funny, it's still bad. So the real surface level obvious thing is that she's a composer, and being a composer means being in control. Everyone pays attention to you, and you conduct and tell everyone what to do and when to do it. And then the parallel is that we see all sorts of ways that she herself is manipulative or clearly has problems with wanting to be controlling. Like she's sort of gaslighting this one girl, looking through people's personal things, threatens a child. She also identifies this one guy as an anxious liberal cuck, and she seems to take pleasure in going on the offensive and putting him on the spot. By the way, I should mention that whole scene is pretty famous because, politics. Something I can't look past is that this guy she's talking to feels a lot like a liberal stereotype. I just don't know if anyone would really talk like this, especially someone who's so unwilling to be challenged on his beliefs in this regard. Like, he's asked about Bach, and he immediately relates it to identity politics, but then he seems totally unprepared for the fact that's something a composer might want to talk about. A friend, when talking about this film, told me, this is cleverly showing she's a hypocrite, because early on, she did relate her assessment of music to people's personalities. I don't know about that. Like, there's a difference between considering someone's personal experience when listening to their art and just outright saying, I refuse to engage with one of the most famous composers of all time because he was problematic. Also, this guy did tell me that there's a lot of clever, complex stuff going on with the way classical music is employed in the film. And I said at the time, maybe knowing that might improve my opinion of it. The thing is, now a few years removed from that conversation, I literally cannot remember anything that he told me. And the fact that I know I've been told this and not retained it and didn't pick up on anything particularly interesting about the music in this film tells me it's not that important to me. What I did remember is there's a load of stuff just in the middle of the film where Tar is basically going crazy, and honestly I just found it weird and pointless. This film is sort of halfway between an art film that you can forgive that sort of absurdity and a serious drama where you're actually supposed to believe these are real people. Part of what's driving her crazy is that she's being harassed by some people, and also there's a whole drama around one of the women she's manipulated having taken her own life. What I find more interesting than this, indeed most interesting, is that there's this Russian cellist who Tar has a interesting relationship with, in that she seems to sort of disrespect Tar in a way that disarms her. To me, that's pretty interesting. This predatory woman then getting thrown off by this younger girl who seems totally impervious to her manipulation and even sort of turns the tables on her. That's interesting, but it's not a major part of the film. The two main women in the film actually just have this really boring, mopey energy for the whole time. Like, I think this film has the most resting frown face of any film I've ever seen. Just everyone's neutral expression is one of moderately disgusted misery. Very depressing. Anyway, in the end she gets Me Too'd. I do enjoy that this exists in a fantasy world where anyone cares enough about conductors that she'd be famous enough to get Me Too'd. Like, who is the most famous conductor right now? The correct answer is nobody. There's no such thing as a famous conductor. Speaking of being dismissive, the end of this film is pretty funny, as I guess it's treated as a purgatorial punishment that she's forced to perform video game music for a load of video game fans. Cringe. Anyway, overall, I just didn't get much out of this movie. Also, I didn't like that it started off with an interview. That always feels like a lazy way to introduce loads of themes by just having characters talking about big important stuff. Very tell, don't show. But yeah, if this movie was less than 2 hours, I'd probably like it a lot more. But as things stand, it's just of very little interest to me whatsoever. High 5 out of 10. So in the midst of Oscars, this film, Causeway, is a bit of a respite. Not because it's especially good, but because it's firstly very short at just over an hour and a half. And also, it's not really that deep. It's basically just like one of these generic dime a dozen dramas you'll see about some sad person with a personal issue they need to overcome. My main beef with the film is that it's overall pretty miserable and uneventful, which I can tolerate in films that have some deeper thematic point, but here it just gets a bit boring. I'm also predisposed to hate this movie because it's about a war veteran, and in principle, I really don't like sob stories about the US military because of, the things they do. In this case, this is about a woman who was deployed to Afghanistan and then got injured by an IED that gave her a traumatic brain injury. Although actually, a brain injury that heals so quickly after the first scene that it kind of feels like the first scene was pretty stupid. Like, it starts off with her at some sort of care home where she's struggling to talk, to walk, and even go to the bathroom room on her own. And then after only like 2 scenes, she's basically back to normal, except for that she occasionally drops stuff and also she's sad. She also struggles with panic attacks, which I also struggle with panic attacks, so I'm always interested to see how a movie presenting them handles it. In this case, her panic attacks did feel very underacted, and I don't know if that's just because everyone presents in different ways, or it's just a limit in the quality of the acting. Like for me, my early panic attacks until I got a handle on it consisted of me falling to the floor and screaming that I was going to die. Which, maybe that's more extreme, maybe that's a me thing, but here I think they're trying to suggest she has PTSD and panic attacks, but it's just like she breathes slightly faster and has to pull over the car. The last time I had a panic attack in the car, it was a lot more like that iconic Hank scene from Breaking Bad. I'm not meaning to suggest that more extreme health issues automatically mean a more compelling character journey, but there needs to be something to make this more intense. Although even if she did struggle with serious mental health issues, again, can I morally support a film expecting us to sympathise with an individual who travelled halfway around the world to kill people who presented no harm to her? It's especially ironic that her brother is in prison for drug dealing, and the Taliban was actively restricting the heroin trade in Afghanistan until the US invasion led to a massive increase in opium poppy cultivation. So who should really be in prison? What's really crazy is that she actually wants to go back to Afghanistan. That's her main goal in the film, to be redeployed by proving she's overcome her mental and physical issues. So this isn't even like a movie where we're supposed to understand this soldier as wrestling with the evil thing she did. She actually wants to go back. Apparently, she wants to go back because she has loads of trauma back home, but they never elaborate on what any of that is. Seems most of her trauma is tied up with having gone to war. We do see some other aspects of her relationships at home, obviously with her brother who's a drug dealer, but then also with her mum. There isn't too much to this relationship. There's some vague tension between them, but just the same awkwardness that can exist between any child and parent if there hasn't been an established precedent for being emotionally open. The main relationship is with this random dude she randomly meets due to some random car trouble, and I stress how randomly this encounter is because, entirely and ridiculously coincidentally, he happens to also have some trauma surrounding a car crash. In his case, it's that he was driving a car when he crashed it and killed his kids, which is bad, and certainly a fine foundation for a deep character relationship, but honestly I could never get past the almost comical coincidence of them both having such similar trauma. You might be wondering if they get into a relationship, and let me say that J-Law's character is in fact a lesbian, which, that's another coincidence I guess. Right after Tar, we have another story about an evil lesbian. The diversity of this film is also kind of funny because she's a lesbian, and her male friend is black, and then her drug-dealing brother is death. What is this, some kind of woke PBS kids show? Despite being lesbian, during an emotionally intimate moment with her new guy friend, she does end up kissing him, and this causes some confusion because she says that she only did it because she felt sorry for him because of his tragic story, but obviously getting a pity kiss just makes him sadder. It's kind of funny, he almost has a weird incel friendzone grievance because he is basically just mad that this woman he's friends with won't shag him, but at the same time, I don't blame him when she's giving him mixed signals like that. But yeah, the friendzone aspect of it is that he's really nice to her throughout the entire film, but then when she rescinds her kiss from him, he goes on a rant about how he does loads of nice stuff for her and she doesn't appreciate it, with the implication being that appreciating it would mean putting out. I actually like this. It's a nice moment of emotional and moral nuance in contrast to if he was just a totally nice guy purely out of the goodness of his own heart. In the end, she decides that she actually wants to move in with him and they can hang out together as friends. I choose to believe that eventually he cures her and they can get married. Shame this guy wasn't around to save Lydia Tarr from her degeneracy. I'm actually not really sure why she decides against rejoining the military in the end. The main plot of the film is about her wanting to do that, but then she sort of just out of nowhere decides, actually, screw that, I'll just go shack up with this man instead. Overall, this film did contrast with Tar interestingly. It's about a miserable lesbian, and it has this general downer energy throughout. The conspicuous negative is that this film has far, far less artistic value than Tar, which is just overall a really well-made movie. This movie, on the other hand, feels way more like a student film, YouTube sketch, or most TV shows before TV became quite so prestige. However, this film has two big things going for it. Firstly, I actually do like that it's centered on a pretty interesting relationship that didn't just make me depressed. It helps that neither of these people are just wholly toxic. And it's shorter, which means that even though I technically get less out of the film than I do from Tar, because this is over an hour shorter, I'd easily choose to watch this one a second time if I had to choose. But yeah, short as it is, I still really don't have any interest in seeing this film again. With that said, I think this is a middling 6, maybe a low 6, but yeah, it gets bonus points for not wasting my time, so middling 6 it is. Actually, a low 6 because of the whole veteran thing. Low 6 it is. Also, I'm just writing now that I was looking back through all these reviews after finishing. I spent a good few minutes trying to remember what this film even was, and even after reading part of the review, I still couldn't remember immediately. Easily the most forgettable film of this Oscar season. More like Badatar, the bad of Badter. I don't know if I can tell you much about this film, but I can tell you what I was doing on my phone for the entire runtime. Not enough to keep me entertained, because this is a long time to keep yourself entertained. Yeah, this is going to be one of those moments where I invoke my contention that the quality of the movie isn't just about whether it's good, but also whether it justifies being the length it is. Even if this was just a cheap, thrown together, hour-and-a-half movie, I still think I wouldn't have liked it that much. The giant issue is I just don't care about this universe at all. I don't care about these characters. I don't care about any conflict or anything. I will say that yes, this film looks pretty good, but actually there were some moments that looked straight up like a video game. Big one that stood out as fake is when this shark thing jumps out of the water to try and eat one of those little dinosaur birds they ride. Oh, that's another thing I don't like about this film. It really doesn't feel that alien. My memory is that the first film had this ethereal, dreamlike quality that actually did feel a little more like you were in a totally alien planet. This movie honestly feels like it could have been set in a prehistoric version of Earth. In some sense, assuming it's all entirely computer generated, I guess it is impressive that for the most part it does look super real, but all of these great special effects don't feel in service of anything. I guess we should talk about the characters. Jake Sully is boring. He doesn't have any sort of journey in this film like he did in the first film, because the first film was about him totally changing loyalties, while this is about him just existing. His love interest also doesn't have a character, but I don't even think she did in the first film either. She's just there. The main characterization exists for his children, but I don't really remember any of them. Like, I can't even tell you how many children he has. He has a daughter who is considered a weirdo and bullied based on that, but it turns out she actually has this deep spiritual connection to nature. He also has a son who's always getting in trouble, but there's not really a character around that, so it's sort of just to facilitate the fact his older brother needs to take care of him. The main character I remember is the older brother, because he and Jake butt heads, and then in the end he dies, which is pretty crazy, you know, having Jake's son die in the film. There's also this kid called Spider, who is a human they've adopted, and for some reason they never made a Na'vi suit for him. I've seen this film before, and I remember that he had sort of dual loyalties, with some commitment to the humans, but no, he's pretty much loyal to the Na'vi the whole time, and him being captured feels pretty much pointless. He's captured, by the way, by his dad, the bad guy from the previous film, and there's a whole stupid thing about him being back to life even though he died. The logic is pretty stupid, but what really bothers me is why bring back this totally one-dimensional villain? He's just evil. That's all there is to him, not even slightly interesting. They try to act like his relationship with his son could be interesting, but he was a baby when his dad died, so they didn't really actually know each other at all. Also, even the central conflict is just so much more boring than the first one. The first one had this specific resource they were fighting over, and it felt like this was very much a clash of civilizations. In this film, the resource they're fighting over is mostly incidental, even though it's actually insane because it stops humans aging, so that seems like a big deal. But the acquiring of this resource is actually just a cover for what really matters to the bad guy, which is a personal vendetta against Jake and his commitment to hunt him down. The middle part of this film actually has nothing to do with the primary antagonist though. It's just about the Sullys having fled to the water tribes of Pandora and trying to fit in there. There's a whole load of stuff with them trying to fit in and the Sullys experiencing racism for being half human, and then on top of that, they have to learn all the specific ways these water people operate in contrast to them. The world building is very lacking. We don't really find out anything more about this planet except that there does exist another group of Na'vi on it. I actually did enjoy the stuff about Jake Sully leading guerrilla warfare against the humans at the beginning. Making this movie more of a Vietnam War parallel or something would be interesting. Because the antagonist is absent for a lot of the film, most of it has no action at all. The main thing that stands out about the beginning is the secret base for Sully's operation is revealed to be right next to where the final battle of the previous film took place, which seems sort of ridiculous to me. Like, didn't they think it might be a good idea to move? Well, eventually they move, and like I say, that part of the film is just entirely about family drama, and I couldn't bring myself to get invested. I think part of it is that the characters are entirely CGI. It does just make it more difficult to get invested in them emotionally. But also, even if we had regular actors with these same dynamics, it'd still be pretty trite. And then it all eventually leads to the final confrontation, which is fine, dumb schlock, nothing really to enjoy about it though because I wasn't emotionally invested invested in any of the characters of the wider conflict. Again, this is just about a personal vendetta between two people. There aren't actually very high stakes at all. You know what? I'm done. High 2 out of 10. Boring, way too long, almost no redeeming features. I'd be shocked if this doesn't end up being the film I'd least like to watch again of all the films I review here. Right, next I watched Empire of Light. Being honest, I'm a little bit bigoted against British films where the entire cast is English, and that's because I associate them with the BBC, and the BBC make made-for-TV films, and television films are, in my experience, intentionally designed to appeal to the lowest common denominator. Like, they don't try to appeal to people who are interested in anything in particular, and as such might want to go to the cinema. Their goal is to make it so an entire family can sit down for 2 hours, get to the end and say, well, wasn't that lovely? The problem is, such films thus end up feeling cliché and trite to anyone who expects films to be slightly more emotionally and intellectually involved. Now, as it happens, I think this film actually wasn't made for TV, but nonetheless, this vibe I think spreads into a lot of British filmmaking. Funnily enough, this film is actually about a cinema, and is called Empire of Light, which is presumably referring to the importance of light at a cinema. You might think that with recent discourse that this film would be about the decline in people going to the movie theatre and perhaps have some sort of theme around that, especially since this film is somewhat unnecessarily set in the 80s, but there would be a logic there if the point was to harken back to the cinemas of yesteryear. To be fair, the actual building this is set in is really nice. But yeah, most of what this movie is about is social commentary delivered with the subtlety of a race riot. I felt like I was watching an episode of Doctor Who, the political commentary dialogue was so bad. The second main character after Olivia Colman is this black guy called Stephen, and a short while into the film, a group of thugs just start harassing him and being overtly racist. I don't buy it. Look, I'm not black. I'm not from the 80s. And I'm not saying there wasn't racism then and isn't racism now. But I feel like it probably doesn't manifest in the strong likelihood that any given time a black guy walks down the street, a bunch of people who are just going to say overtly racist things to him. Although maybe these were just a bunch of louts in general who like to harass anyone, so they just picked up on race because that's the easiest thing to target. Maybe after they got done shouting at him about how many bananas he eats, they'd harass some random nerdy looking white guy for wearing glasses. Maybe they're just bullies. The stupidest moment that actually got me laughing is when there's an intense race riot in this small seaside town, and they just start breaking into the cinema like they're a horde of zombies. I don't think they even use anything to break the glass, they just press up against it like a mindless horde and smash their hands against it until it breaks. It's the most ridiculous thing I've ever seen. Significantly, Stephen is just a random black guy minding his own business. I don't know if I can fully communicate how ridiculous this all is in context. They're doing a march against like black people existing, I guess, and the people in the cinema are just stood behind some locked doors watching it play out. And then some people see Stephen behind some locked doors and immediately decide to smash their way into the building and start beating him up. And Stephen, despite seeing like 24 racists smash through a glass door like it's nothing, so fueled up on rabid bloodlust, decides now would be a good time to stand his ground rather than run away. Poor decision. But yeah, I'm sorry, this is just so stupid, like so painfully stupid. I don't buy that anything like this has ever happened in the history of race relations. Even the KKK are a bit subtle about actually attacking black people. You know, they'll wait until they're accused of a crime, or they'll at least attack them at night while they're alone. I've never seen a depiction of racism where the journey from racism exists to there's a black guy, let's immediately beat him to death was quite so short. And this isn't even in service of anything. Believe it or not, this film isn't really about racism, not even tangentially. It's not even like there's a wider theme of racism here or anything, and this is one small part of that. No, instead, the reason for all of these on-the-nose racial attacks seems to be entirely because this movie has a black guy in it. Even personally, it doesn't make much sense. Like, Stephen is having a situationship with Olivia Colman, and at one point he bemoans the fact that she doesn't understand what it's like being black in this country. And he throws out a load of examples, of which the second example is just Thatcher being Prime Minister. Look, whatever you might say about Thatcher, I don't think you can say the simple fact of her being Prime Minister is enough reason for a black guy to feel personally threatened. But yeah, then the weird thing is that Olivia Colman then just changes the subject to something unimportant about skipping stones, and he drops it. So in terms of characterization, this makes no sense. He was supposed to be annoyed that she didn't appreciate his lived experience, and then she proceeds to avoid acknowledging the reality of how hard things are for him, and the film just moves on. So if the point isn't to advance anything to do with their characters, then I can only presume the point is just some self-flagellating account of how racist the UK was in the 1980s. Remember the racist zombie hordes of the 1980s? Tough times for my black British brothers. Seemingly similar to this, at another point, Olivia Colman and Stephen have an argument where Colman goes on a massive rant about men and how awful and controlling they are. You know, it seems like it's going to be the classic oppression Olympics between a black man and a white woman, racism versus sexism, place your bets, which is worse. And again, similarly, Stephen sort of just ignores this outburst, so it seems like the point of this is to just be a reminder that sexism exists. But instead, it turns out that Olivia Colman is schizophrenic. We already knew that she had some sort of mental issues because we see her talking to a doctor, but I imagine most viewers assumed, like me, it was just depression or something. Finding out she's actually schizophrenic is probably the most interesting part of the movie just because it's a twist in light of all the character things she's been doing, and we're also told this before she starts acting really crazy. You know, it is, I guess, a little bit emotionally affecting watching her struggle with a lot of mental turmoil, especially considering what an awkward situation she's in with having a sexual relationship with both Stephen and Colin Firth. Yeah, Colin Firth is in this movie because, I don't know, it's a really small irrelevant role. He's the owner of the theatre who has Coleman jerk him off, despite the fact he knows she's schizophrenic. Stephen, to be fair, doesn't bang her after discovering she's crazy. The relationship between her and Stephen is a bit weird because, like, what is the actual appeal here? I mean, Stephen's a young guy, so I can imagine any middle-aged woman just being like, that seems fun, would take me back to when I was young, especially if she's having a bit of a midlife crisis. And I can also understand a young guy going along with it if he also thinks it sounds fun to be with an older woman. You know, it's a well-kept secret, but most guys aren't that fussy about who they have sex with. The problem is, when it starts getting more emotionally involved, I feel like there's no reason why Stephen would be going along with this. And I actually feel kind of sorry for him because he's in the process of applying to university. That would make him, I guess, like 18 or 19 years old, and he's having to deal with this clinically insane 50-year-old woman. Even before we discover she's schizophrenic, she is often mad and flying off the handle in every interaction, so why would he like her? Anyway, after it's revealed she's crazy, the film sort of loses momentum in that there's nowhere left to go from here. Stephen ends up dating some other random woman and Olivia Colman seems to have gotten over it. In fact, the last part of the film is this very cheesy display of how, don't worry, she's actually quite happy in the end. Like they host a special party for her birthday when she comes back from the mental hospital, and then there's this moment where she just sits there watching a film in the movie theatre and has some sort of emotional catharsis, but the whole thing is very cringy. Anyway, the thing about this movie is it turns out it actually isn't that well reviewed and was only nominated for cinematography. To be fair, the cinematography is pretty good, and like I say, the movie theatre itself looked really pretty, and there's this abandoned section of it, which again seems very cool. Me personally though, I've got to be honest, if I don't like the story, then the quality of the cinematography isn't really capable of saving a movie for me. If the movie is just fine and the cinematography is fantastic, that's one thing, but if the story is actively bad, that's not great. And yeah, I don't know if I've stressed enough how bad this movie is, but it's just totally cliche and pointless. My rule is that a film is a 1 out of 10 if I'm actively cringing and just embarrassed from watching it, and this film did have some moments like that. I think if there's supposed to be a really serious scene and I'm laughing at it because it's so stupid and forcing such unearned emotions, that's a bad sign. But the film does have redeeming elements, so I'm not actually going to rate it a 1. Still, I do think this film is very bad, so I'm going to give it a high 2. Okay, so I guess it's appropriate I'm reviewing The Banshees of Inisherin after Empire of Light, even though my original plan was to do it the other way around, but shit happened. But yeah, it's convenient because you have the blandest, most forgettable movie in the world, and then you have this movie, which I like simply because it's strange. Sometimes with a movie, I just want to have a strange experience because, you know, basic stories can be entertaining, but something that feels genuinely otherworldly can be really special. In the case of this film, I like it because it starts off with a really simple premise. Randomly, one day, one guy decides he doesn't want to be friends with another guy, even though heretofore they've been good friends. So to me, that's already kind of interesting because it's taking this very familiar thing of two people being friends, but then it's just adding this weird, absurdist twist into the mix that doesn't reflect anybody's actual experiences. I mean, I can't think of having ever heard of one person just deciding to stop being friends with someone else before, without any disagreement or fight or drama. And immediately my thoughts were that this movie might be a lot like my favourite movie of all time, A Serious Man. That movie is just about a guy who loads of bad things in his life start happening to, and the point of it is that there is no explanation. So I was thinking this might be similar, in that the primary point is that there's just no explanation for one guy just deciding to stop being friends with the other. However, we do eventually get 3 explicit and related reasons for why Brendan Gleeson decides to stop being friends with Colin Farrell. The first and simplest is is that Brendan finds Colin dull. There isn't too much to this explanation, and it doesn't explain why he only just randomly starts thinking this now. It is quite funny just how simple and unambitious Colin is in terms of how he lives his life. This movie has that intrinsic rural comedy to it. Like just something about the customs and the idiosyncrasies of this particular remote Irish island feels like there's a constant in-joke we're party to. It's the same reason Father Ted is so entertaining. I can't imagine Father Ted wasn't a partial inspiration for this. Indeed, at 2 points, Brendan has an argument with the local priest, and both times it's just this really funny, engaging, and sort of absurdist conversation. The second reason is that Brendan wants to focus on playing music, and he considers talking to Colin to be a waste of time when he could be working on music. There's a bit more thematic substance. First, in Brendan's desire to leave something after he's gone. It seems like this has all come from a recognition of his own mortality, and that's why he wants to do something great with his life before he dies. I can partially relate to this. There is an idea that a lot of the time your personal attachments can hold you back from being the very best person you could be and achieving true greatness. Also, this touches on whether it's better to live a good life here and now, or to be remembered after you're gone. Brendan says that being nice is of no value, because nobody is remembered for centuries based on how nice they were. Although his desire to play music rings a little hollow when he ends up trying to get Colin to realise he doesn't want to be friends anymore by chopping off his fingers to prove he's serious. This moment is where the film really becomes more of a black comedy. It's still absurdist and almost comedic, but it's also played pretty serious that he has self-mutilated himself. And this leads to the third explanation, which is that he's just depressed. And if so, this is an interesting depiction of depression. The titular Banshees are the subject of Brendan's song he's working on, and he speculates that Banshees watch human tragedies for their own amusement. Perhaps the Banshees are a representation of his depression. I'd prefer this film if he left the central question of why he doesn't like Colin entirely ambiguous, but the answer being depression is still interesting, as that remains just as depressing and unfulfilling, and of course there's no resolution to the story in the end. The main thing I dislike about the film is that it has an incredibly unsubtle analogy in it, which I like subtlety. Basically, all of this is concurrent with the Irish Civil War, and the characters repeatedly mention the Irish conflict as this absurd squabble that makes no sense. The parallels to the central inexplicable conflict of the film itself are painfully obvious. And what the film is saying also just seems really basic. Like, it really confuses me that in this otherwise absurd and at times sort of inaccessible film, there's a message as simple as, war is pointless and bad. There's also the question of whether it's actually appropriate to characterize this particular conflict as pointless. I know some Irish people get annoyed when the media presents the Irish conflicts as pointless violence because in their mind there is a point. Now personally, I do think the whole island thing is pretty silly. In my mind they're British and that's all there is to it. They can believe they're not and that's fine, but I don't accept it. So I guess in the analogy of this movie, I'd be like Colin Farrell and Irish nationalists would be like Brendan Gleeson. I just want to be friends with them, but they don't want to be friends with me anymore, and I just don't get it. And chopping your fingers off to prove a point, that works quite well as analogous to all the Irish people who died in this fight, a lot more than the Englishmen who died. But yeah, I'm not sure if this film actually invites much artistic consideration of Irish independence and dramas thereof, because like I say, the apparent message seems incredibly simple. Just every single time they mention the war, I could only think, yes, okay, I get it. Speaking of getting it though, the fact the parallels seem generally pretty obvious does have me wondering about the character of Dominic. He's this third character who seems kind of random. There's 4 things about him of note. First, he's incredibly stupid, easily the stupid person on this island, it's agreed. Secondly, his father, who is the local police chief, beats him up. Thirdly, he has a crush on Colin's sister and even asks her out. And fourthly, he dies randomly off screen, supposedly because he slipped and fell into a lake. Now, I don't really know what the point of this was supposed to be, and I don't know if it's supposed to relate to something in the Irish Civil War, but I would imagine not. I'm not sure if it's supposed to represent anything to do with the core themes of depression, leaving behind a legacy, or just changes in life that seem inscrutable. Obviously, you could relate it to all of those things if you want. His life is pretty depressing, but the fact he's stupid means he keeps being optimistic in asking out Colin's sister. But then his death shows that sometimes sad things happen we can't avoid. He obviously doesn't leave behind any sort of legacy, and more to the point, if he is the only son of his dad, which he might well be, then this means his dad abused the son who would have been carrying his name, drove him away, and now he'll leave behind no heir. And if the overriding point is that sometimes sad, pointless things happen, and there's no point trying to find a deeper meaning in them, then obviously the character works great for that. But yeah, considering how obvious a lot of the symbolism is, it's just strange that the character of Dominic has such an elusive meaning in terms of his role in the film. And in conclusion, I'm sort of in 2 minds. The big negative is obvious. The overall central message seems mostly way too obvious, and that makes the film less interesting to me. funny. The big positive is that the strangeness of the interpersonal stuff makes the film intrinsically interesting, and that leaves me enjoying it. Overall, I've seen this film twice and could happily watch it a third time because it is, in general, incredibly well made. And yeah, like I say, I really like films that provide a unique experience, which for the most part this does. However, its limitations mean that in my assessment, this can't be a 9 out of 10, which it could have been with just a few changes. Instead, I'd probably consider this to be a high 8. So I've actually already reviewed the original Disney Pinocchio when I reviewed the first 22 Disney animated movies for a video on the channel where I have originally been doing these Oscar reviews. And I guess the main question going into this would be, does it improve on the Disney version? Because if it doesn't, then you should just watch that, and that makes this pointless, so who cares? My first major criticism of the Disney version was that actually Pinocchio didn't behave that badly. He was mostly just pressured into things, and they didn't commit to having him actually volitionally behave poorly himself. In the case of this film, they do make him willfully behave worse a bit more often, like he just disobeys his father at a few points, and he isn't pressured that intensely when he does misbehave, but again, it still doesn't really work, because the last time he chooses to do something bad is less than an hour into the movie, where he decides to join a circus so he can earn money for Geppetto. You'll note there that even in that case, he's trying to do something good, and he's just being very naive about what the consequences of joining the circus will actually be. But after that, he doesn't really make any choices that have much of a moral dimension to them at all. He does choose to mock a bunch of fascists, so maybe in this film's logic, that's a bad thing. This movie is set during World War II in fascist Italy, so that is just like a thing happening in the background. Like, one of the major characters is this fascist general. In terms of the story, the big thing is that after Pinocchio realizes Stromboli is a bit of a meanie, he decides to sabotage a performance he's supposed to be giving to the fascist elite. The way he does it is just by adding the word poop and fart randomly to the song he's supposed to be singing, which sounds really dumb, but is, to be fair, probably pretty accurate to what a kid would actually do. So yeah, I don't know if this is him misbehaving. Is this like an extreme version of you're not supposed to punch a Nazi? You're not even supposed to say rude words in front of them? If you do that, you're no better than them. Anyway, based on his decision to do this, he gets drafted into the army, or like a young training version of the army, and that's most of the rest of the film, and he doesn't have much agency for that. So if the film is supposed to be about learning to be a good boy, and that is what it's supposed to be about, then it's weird that the vast majority of the movie is not focused on any decisions Pinocchio makes in that regard. And even at the beginning, he misbehaves, but that's mostly from overt enthusiasm. Like, the first example of him disobeying Geppetto is when Geppetto tells him not to go to church. Now, the reason for that is to avoid causing a panic, since he's a wooden boy walking around, and when people see him, they do think he's some sort of demon. But at the same time, I mean, being overly eager to go to church doesn't really qualify as supremely immoral by most Christian standards of morality. The worst thing about Pinocchio is that he's just really annoying. I can't really substantiate that, he just has an annoying voice and he's really hyperactive and it irritates me. Another criticism I had of the original was that Jiminy Cricket doesn't do anything, but he's still rewarded. Here, they even lampshade the fact he didn't really do anything, because he didn't. The problem is that if it's not really clear in what sense Pinocchio is actually that bad, then him turning around and being more moral doesn't have any weight, which means he doesn't have a redemption, and the whole becoming a real boy thing doesn't work. In this case, the mechanics behind becoming a real boy are totally different. Indeed, Pinocchio doesn't want to become a real boy, because as a puppet he can die and come back as many times as he likes. There is a weird stipulation that he has to wait for longer periods of time each time he dies before coming back, but it's still only a few seconds, so it doesn't really seem like that big of a deal, until he needs to go back immediately to save Geppetto during the whole being eaten by a whale incident at the end. But he discovers if he goes back prematurely, he will from that point onwards be mortal. So yeah, unlike the Disney version where becoming a real boy is his main objective, here it's actually a sacrifice he makes to save Geppetto. Overall, I prefer the idea he wants to be a real boy because that makes him more relatable than being content to just be a puppet, but I do appreciate that him choosing to give his life is more of a sacrifice, almost Christ-like. Indeed, I did think this movie was going to have some sort of Christianity theme based on how it starts. There's even a slight temptation in the desert moment where Stromboli tells him if he becomes a circus star, all the world will bow at his feet. They also had biblically accurate angels in this, which is cool. But the best representation of how this isn't really about Christianity is that there's this whole drama at the start where his original son is killed in a church, so he never got around to finishing building the crucifix because of the trauma. But then as soon as Pinocchio is around, they immediately fix the crucifix together. It's literally the first thing they do. The obvious explanation would be because now he has a son, so his trauma is healed. But this is so early on, it just feels like it's not earned. And indeed, at that point, Geppetto really doesn't think of Pinocchio as a son. That's another weird thing about this film. Geppetto doesn't really like Pinocchio. When he first makes him, it's in a drunken, violent rage. He's mad about his son being dead, so he makes a new son out of wood. But the whole thing is presented more like he's Frankenstein going full mad scientist. And then, when Pinocchio is around, he doesn't show any love for him at all, and once he joins the circus, they don't even interact, so there isn't much of an emotional core to the relationship. The other big part of this story is of course the whole lying thing, because lies are as plain as the nose on your face. Yep. It's weird though, he doesn't actually lie that much in the story. In fact, in no version of Pinocchio I'm aware of is him lying a significant part of his character growth. Here he even explicitly says he needs food because he's dying of hunger, and it doesn't grow. I guess magic can identify hyperbole. But yeah, I don't know, shouldn't the point be that he encounters a load of situations where he discovers that lying doesn't work? Although I guess the story kind of paints itself into a corner. Because, you know, if his nose immediately grows when he lies, then that means he doesn't really learn lying is bad because it's wrong to lie, but just that lying is bad because you'll be immediately found out. Anyway, two artistic considerations. Firstly, this film has several songs, and I personally didn't like any of them, although there is one song I have a memory of as I'm writing this a little while after watching it. It's just this song he sings about how he likes everything. Can't remember the tune though. The film fails the main musical test of would I actually listen to any of these songs just for the sake of jamming and enjoying them? Absolutely not. Also, this film has a unique animation style. It's kind of creepy, and I actually find it sort of ugly looking, but I guess it's at least interesting. For me, my big question for this film is whether there was anything so good about it that it means you should watch this over or in addition to the Disney version. And the answer there is an emphatic no. It has Pinocchio be slightly more morally complex, but that's at the cost of him being more annoying. And overall, there's still a whole lot of stuff that feels like it should be central, which nonetheless really isn't sufficiently explored here. The whole Italian fascism thing is interesting, and it just occurred to me this movie might be set exactly when the original film was released, but I wouldn't say the film does that much of the setting. So yeah, because I just think this film is pretty pointless, even while being tolerably watchable, I can only give it a middling 6. Right, so next I watched the movie To Leslie, or not to Leslie, that is the question. So this movie sort of feels very played out, but that's not necessarily a terrible thing. Lots of movies return to old familiar tropes. Basically, this is a story about a person who's a train wreck. You know, the basic plot is that she is an alcoholic, she is estranged from her child, and she has a whole load of interpersonal drama with lots of baggage from her old life. The slight novelty is that it starts off with the revelation she won the lottery, and that she threw away all of that money through poor life choices. Now, the idea of someone winning the lottery and then ending up worse off than they were before they won is something a lot of people talk about, so it sort of feels cliche. But to be fair, I don't think I've ever seen a movie about that premise. I have, however, seen a lot of movies about addicts of various descriptions making their way through their sad, sad life as they struggle with all of their various interpersonal relationships. At first, I thought this might be a cyclical thing, where we see how she sabotages all her relationships as she progresses through them. It starts off with her relying on her son, who actually has a job, is working quite hard, and resents having to take care of her. And she's really bad in this context. She literally steals money from him so she can go out drinking. And obviously, as soon as he finds this out, he calls the police and has her kicked out of his house, which is fair enough. She's not a very good mother. I will say, and this isn't necessarily suggesting he's a bad actor, but at one point when he's arguing, he says the word mother, and it sounds just like that SNL sketch. You know, where Fred Armistice is like, "Hey, I am your mother!" And he literally sounds exactly like that. Anyway, so then she goes to hang out with these two people who I'm not sure what their relationship is. She calls them Butch and Nancy. And again, they put her up in their house, they laid some ground rules, but then she repeatedly goes out and gets drunk, and they end up kicking her out too. Then, being all homeless, she's hanging around a motel, and inexplicably, the manager of it comes out and decides to offer her a job as a maid, even though there's no indication that she'd be at all capable of doing that. And indeed, she repeatedly sleeps in past her alarm, does a sloppy job with the cleaning, drinks on the job, and yes, gets drunk all the time. Eventually, the manager has to be called out to pick her up because she literally walks into her old house where she used to live and majorly freaks out the family already living there because this is all in the middle of the night. Very inappropriate. And then when he drops her off, her suitcase is in front of the door because she's being kicked out. You might be thinking that actually sounds a little bit repetitive, and yeah, it sort of is. There are nuances to her relationships to these three people. I mean, the third guy is just ridiculous. I have no idea why he thought it would work out. But yeah, I'm not wholly averse to movies that just show a self-destructive person self-destroying their own life on repeat. But it's hard to then look back on it and think of it as being especially entertaining. But at this point, about halfway through, things start to get interesting. Because firstly, even though the hotel staff put her suitcase outside, she still has keys to the room. So she goes inside and starts just looking at old photos. And for a minute I was thinking, are they not kicking her out? Is it just that they gave her back her suitcase? She lost it earlier on. I was wondering if I was seriously misreading the scene, but no, it turns out that actually they are kicking her out. It's just that they didn't bother to change the locks, which, fair enough. So the next day, he's knocking for her to get up, but turns out actually she's already up and has been cleaning the rooms already, and she promises she's turned over a new leaf and begs for a second chance. So yeah, at least this is something, but it's also sort of the movie moving from one cliche to another and as such becoming a little bit more boring. See, a movie about someone who's just not living their best life and they keep not living their best life is a bit one note, but at least that means it's a bit emotionally subversive. By contrast, this is a much more formulaic story about a woman who turns her life around after hitting rock bottom, and it ultimately has a happy ending. And the movie does get slightly worse at this point, most obviously because they have to force some drama. They suddenly have everyone in the town become comically mean. Like suddenly nobody believes that she can really change, and this one guy makes fun of her by reenacting the news interview from when she was a lottery winner, which really upsets her. And then the hotel manager, who has heretofore been helping her get back on her feet and sort of being an accountability partner, has the biggest brain fart ever. For some reason, he then thinks it would be a good idea for them to watch the news interview from when she won the lottery together. And I don't just mean so that she can confront her past trauma. No, I mean he thinks that she will actually just enjoy watching this moment that will remind her of how she threw away a fortune and completely changed her life for the worse. She's just sat there on the verge of a mental breakdown the whole time, and then it finishes. And the guy is just like, wow, that was great, we should watch it again. And finally she has to be like, dude, are you okay? Do you have any, theory of mind at all? Do you not understand that actually this is not something I would want to watch? He kind of justifies it by being like, hey, I just wanted to remind you that you used to be happy and you used to be a success and not a big failure. But yeah, that's really stupid because she won the lottery. That doesn't speak to her having some sort of admirable quality as a person. She just got lucky, and then she screwed it up because of her evident lack of quality as a person. So yeah, based on this guy's sheer stupidity, she has the most valid crash out ever, quits her job and heads out to the bar, and he has to go looking for her. I think in the end it's implied she actually resisted drinking, but certainly she doesn't fall off the wagon long term. The reason I'm a little down on this portion of the movie is because so much of the drama comes from stupid people acting stupidly, rather than anything that feels realistic. I imagine the actual drama of someone struggling with overcoming an addiction is quite hard to properly portray in a movie because so much of it is experienced internally. I mean, I quit alcohol because I was struggling to not consume it excessively when I was doing so habitually, but I'm a bit weird in that as soon as I resolved to stop drinking, I actually wasn't tempted at all. Anyway, it turns out she didn't go off the deep end, and she actually has a plan to take her renewed sense of purpose to the next level by fixing up an abandoned shop opposite the motel and turning it into a diner. The first night things don't go well because nobody shows up and she is again tempted to drink, but she resists. I will say the idea that the diner wouldn't be profitable doesn't make much sense to me because it's right opposite the motel. If people are using the motel, they'll almost certainly be using this diner. In fact, it's kind of weird that every motel doesn't have a diner opposite. It's ridiculous that sometimes when I've stayed at hotels, I've had to walk some distance just to get a cooked breakfast, when I'd pay more if there was a diner right across the road. Either way, if the motel is doing so well it can afford to employ unreliable alcoholics, I imagine her diner would do just fine. What's weird is that she then has a conversation with Nancy, where she suggests that Nancy has intentionally turned everyone away from the diner out of spite. Which, there's not really any reason to think she would do that, and it seems like she hasn't done that, and in fact she's brought back Leslie's son so that they can have a happy reunion. There is one line which is kind of confusing because it either implies that a year passes between her deciding to fix up the diner and it first opening, which would seem like a very long time, or it implies that only a year has passed since her life went down the drain, which seems like too short an amount of time. Because basically she says to Nancy, hey, if you were just going to try to sabotage me, why didn't you do it a year ago when I first started doing this? Or words to that effect, probably not quoting her directly there. So my initial interpretation of this was that Leslie was talking about fixing up the diner, but then Nancy is like, man, I wish I would have stopped you because it's been so sad watching you destroy your life. But so what exactly happened a year ago? There's no way that her quitting alcohol and starting her own business could be considered destroying her life. So presumably they're talking about her destroying her life in terms of going off the rails of drinking, but
Has that been going on for just a year? The film implies this has been much more enduring of an issue for her than that. Whatever, it just confused me. The ending is a bit cheesy. She makes him a plate of mum's spaghetti and then they hug and they're all happy now. Oh, also, turns out the motel guy was like into her romantically, and that's why he helped her out. The romance aspect is kind of underdeveloped, but yeah, I guess it makes sense that they'd hook up in the end. I will say that the woman who plays Leslie was nominated for a Best Actress award, which I was like, yeah, I guess that makes sense. But then I found out this woman was from Newcastle in England, which is very, very different from some random rural town in the southern US, which is where this is set. I mean, I know that Brits being good at playing Americans is frequently observed, and everyone likes to talk about how shocking it is to find out that actors who play famous American characters are actually British. So I'm not saying this is some unique feat of acting for a British person to so convincingly play an American, but yeah, I would not have guessed in a million years that she was British. She just seemed like such a stereotypical American white trash hick. That's the best compliment I've ever paid a woman. Anyway, overall the film is good but kind of cliche. It's a low 7. There's some quality evident, but it's not some fantastic piece of art that I'd be especially interested in returning back to. So I probably had a different experience of Aftersun than most people in at least one way. See, for me, this movie just made me feel tired, uncomfortable, and gross. And that's because it's set on a Mediterranean holiday, and it brought back memories. We used to go on holiday in Spain often, and I just remember it would always be hot and sweaty, and the sunscreen would make you feel sticky, and you get sand stuck to the sunscreen, and then no matter how much you showered, you'd still somehow have one grain of sand that would get into your bed, and that would make the bed really uncomfortable, and then your skin would be tender because you still got burnt, and you can feel the sand irritating your burn, and then the bedding would never be comfortable, nor would the mattress, and when you're trying to sleep, you hear the sound of people outside because there's lots of people partying, so you're kept up, and then the water tastes funny, and your mouth is dry from the salt of the sea. It's all just such an awful experience. I do not understand how people consider it relaxing. Well, until I was old enough to start drinking, and I was like, oh, okay, I see now. That makes sense. It's tolerable now. Anyway, I say that this movie just made me feel viscerally uncomfortable to explain my struggle in working out where this movie was going at the beginning. Because there was a lot of stuff early on that just felt really weirdly ominous, and I thought this was going in a Madeleine McCann direction, especially with all the talk he has about her needing to defend herself. She, the dad's daughter, is also hanging out with a load of older kids, even though she's 11, and there's a lot of degenerate conversation going on in the background of this movie. I swear every conversation overheard from someone else attending is like, oh, I sucked him off or I shagged her. Have some decorum, for goodness sake. So I was thinking this might end up being some sort of drama about his daughter getting into trouble that she shouldn't, and maybe it would end up being quite a disturbing movie. Once I realised the movie was instead much more introspective about the dad, I thought I'd come up with a pretty reasonable theory of what this movie was supposed to be about, but I was wrong. Basically, I thought the main point would be that the dad was resentful of his daughter because she stopped him from having time to grow up. The first evidence of this is that at one point, somebody mistakes the dad for in fact being his daughter's older brother, so they clearly assumed they were quite close in age. The implication there being that he had his daughter at a very young age. Also, he is not together with her mother, but there's a suggestion that things are still very amicable between them, which is maybe what you'd expect from an accidental pregnancy. The other big thing is that there are these recurring flashes of him dancing at a nightclub, and I was thinking, okay, so this is him thinking about the life he missed out on. Say if he had a child at 16 or 17, then he would never have had a chance to live it up partying as a young adult. And then this would explain why his daughter spends much of the movie hanging around with older kids, because the entire movie is about enjoying being young and not wanting to grow up too fast. And yeah, this would explain why at times the dad just seems tired of his daughter, and then there's this tension between them. Even when she does nice things for him, he doesn't seem to appreciate it. At one point, he just abandons her in the middle of the holiday resort, and she ends up going off on her own and easily could have gone missing. That's just terrible behavior from a dad to leave her alone to be potentially abducted. And again, I was thinking this was going to be about how he just wanted to get out of this holiday resort and live his life as if he didn't have a daughter, because that's his enduring source of frustration. Anyway, it was only right at the end that everything suddenly made sense to me. We see a moment of him just crying in his room. Honestly, it's pretty intense crying. I've only a few times properly sobbed as an adult man, and I can confirm that it does look a lot like how it's presented here. It's not dignified or anything like that. It's just a man who's been holding things in to a point of breaking completely, falling apart. And then we pan down to the postcard where he has written to his daughter, telling her to know that he will always love her. And at this point, I'm like, okay, cool. It's a suicide note. Shortly after this, the film ends with the dad waving goodbye to her at the airport, and we can infer that this is the last time she sees him. Indeed, we find out that she is watching back footage from this trip as an adult, and as such, this trip is a very important memory for her because it was her last memory of her dad being alive. Other people have described this movie as really emotionally intense and in fact pretty much devastating. I didn't have that strong of an emotional reaction to it.
What I'd be interested in finding out is how my opinion of this film would change if I watched it a second time. Unfortunately, I'm only in the habit of watching the Best Picture films religiously, and therefore I'm only watching this for the first time for this review. It would be something I'd be interested in watching again now, because I want to know how the film feels when you know that it's ultimately about this dad's suicidal depression. The fact I spent much of this movie thinking plot-wise this could be about some kind of abduction or something, and theme-wise that this was about the emotional nuances of growing up, means that I wasn't really experiencing the film as being about what it was actually about. Still, I did unambiguously like the film, I did find it interesting, and obviously I did have an emotional reaction to it by the end that was pretty strong. I just wouldn't call it devastating. But yeah, I can only judge this entire film as being about what it was in fact about in retrospect, and looking back on it, I don't regard it as being some unparalleled, fantastic exploration of depression. I do like the innovation of exploring this topic through the memories of his daughter. That sort of gets at the lasting impact of when somebody makes a decision like this. The people who really hurt are their family. But yeah, when I think about other films about depression like Manchester by the Sea, I absolutely prefer them. For this film, I'm torn between a low 8 and a high 7. Even though those two ratings are right next to each other, somehow one feels too high and the other too low. Any 7 rating feels low for a film that was actually a deep exploration of a pretty emotionally affecting topic, and a film that displayed some really good quality in terms of acting and presentation. However, an 8 sort of feels too high for a film that wasn't really connecting with me for the vast majority of it. I'm going to assume though that if I watch this film again, I might rate it even a slightly higher 8, so based on that, it at least makes sense to round up and call this a low 8. Right, so Argentina 1985 was, good, but it's one of those historical movies where I'm so interested in the topic that it starts to feel like a documentary more so than a movie. So if you know anything about history and are able to infer that the 1985 in the title is referring to the year, you can probably infer this is something about the military junta that we all only care about when they try to steal the Falklands. And yeah, I guess they had a run of bad luck, because not only did Maggie give them a thumping, but apparently the RGs themselves had had enough by 1985 and they were kicked out. I like to think it's because the average Argentinian recognizes the Falklands are rightfully British, and they were so offended that the government tried to invade that they overthrew them based on that. In reality, I know that the junta only invaded the Falklands to try to regain popularity in the first place, so they probably actually got overthrown because they failed. So, this movie is specifically about a prosecutor who's in charge of prosecuting the junta for their war crimes, so it's basically a courtroom drama similar to a documentation of the Nuremberg trials. So yeah, the documentary aspect is just that you find out a lot more information about how this went down, and at the end, I'm 99% sure they include real footage of people reacting to a key moment of the trial. Of course, what we find out is pretty horrible. The main plot point of the movie is them trying to collect lots of witness testimony against the junta and documenting their war crimes, and it's not pleasant stuff. The standout story is this story about this one woman who was detained and tortured while pregnant, to the point that she actually gave birth while tied up and she wasn't allowed to see her baby. Yeah, these people were real psychos. It's not pleasant to think about the fact this stuff happens, and it's even less pleasant to realize a lot of the time this goes unpunished. Because, when it's the government doing this, who is going to punish them except for another government that manages to overpower them? Something this movie therefore explores is the challenges of how exactly to maintain legitimacy during their proceedings, considering they are putting the previous government on trial. Early on, when all the generals are introducing themselves and stating their name for the record, they all say that they do not recognize the legitimacy of this court because they should be subject to a military rather than a civilian trial. And at one point someone suggests to the main prosecutor, Julio, that they might need to go easy on these war criminals because if not, there could be a military revolt and that would just tear the country apart and make things worse. There's also a mention of the fact that a lot of the general public supports the regime and don't want to admit that they were part of such an evil institution. A pivotal moment in this regard is when the secondary prosecutor gets a call from his mother, who was previously described as a supporter of the regime, saying that she's changed her mind based on the testimony she's heard. There's a massive focus on the fact this trial can't just prove the guilt of these men to the satisfaction of an impartial court, but must actually make the case emotionally convicting to the larger Argentine population. There's a moment to this effect where Julio is sent to meet the new president, who is very cryptic but just says that he needs to make sure that his closing statement is really good. So there's this whole thing where he's working on the speech to try and make it really powerful, although honestly when it's delivered it wasn't that great in my assessment.
moment, there's this really awkward expression, Neronian turning of the thumb, which is supposed to be referring to the leaders having authority over life and death as Roman Emperor Nero did in the gladiatorial matches. I don't know, maybe it sounds more powerful in Spanish. I'm not going to pretend that subtitles don't take away some of the impact of what's being said, because I'm having to combine the phonic quality of them in the delivery with the fact I'm just reading words on a screen in my own monotone, like I'm doing right now. Anyway, the speech ends up being really powerful and everyone likes it. Well done. This feels like when the film could have ended, but it goes on for another 20 minutes. And the ultimate point is that they find out that actually the results were a bit disappointing, with not everyone responsible getting the sentences they really ought to have. It ends with him writing out an appeal and says that the fight for justice for the victims of the regime is still continuing to this day. I guess it makes sense to have a more honest ending that acknowledges this. It's just weird that it was another 20 minutes tacked on, because there's this protracted scene where a kid just explains how he saw the judges at a restaurant, and he explains their body language in detail so Julio and his team can try to infer, based on that, what the likely result will be. I don't know, it just feels like an entirely unnecessary, slow, and not incredibly interesting scene to be included already after the 2-hour point, and right in the middle of what is effectively your conclusion. But yeah, I guess this film had to be a bit cynical because corruption tends to be institutional and there's plenty of acknowledgement the civil servants in the new regime will have a lot of overlap with those from the old. I assume that's why Julio is resistant to having security even when he gets some very unpleasant threatening phone calls. Also, a car gets bombed outside the courtroom. I was wondering if anyone would get killed, but no. Boring. I wanted to see one of the prosecuting people actually get assassinated. Anyway, speaking of corruption, there is some minor drama surrounding why Julio didn't do anything during the junta himself, to which, I mean, my response would be that I didn't want to be one of the people dying while everyone else just ignores it. For me, the big limitation is it did just feel like a movie conveying information. This isn't helped by the fact it starts off with a substantial blurb that feels like a reading assignment just explaining everything. To make this more interesting as a movie, they should have leaned into the personal stuff more. There's a bit earlier on where the dad is concerned that his daughter's new boyfriend might be a spy and the brother is investigating. It's quite a little funny scene that sets up this might be a bit more of a character-driven story than it ultimately ends up feeling. And that limitation disappointed me when this film is not horrendously long, but 2 hours and 20 minutes, which is on the longer end for a movie as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, let's call this a low 7 out of 10. Next, I watched Knives Out. Now, I'm hardly the biggest murder mystery fan. In fact, my experience with the genre is so limited to Murder on the Orient Express that I just took it for granted the only possible solution was that somehow everyone was involved in the murder. But no, in fact, the solution is very conventional, but very surprising, very logical and very well built too. Indeed, I include the caveat that I don't really know many murder mysteries, so it mightn't sound too ridiculous when I say that this is the best murder mystery story I've ever encountered. With that said, a huge part of the appeal is not knowing the information, so usually I don't care about spoilers. But in this case, I would say this film is very good, so watch it first if you haven't seen it. Having said that, even though I've seen this film once before, I actually couldn't remember the solution to the problem because it's been quite a while since it came out. In fact, it just occurred to me I've forgotten to mention that this film of course wasn't in contention for the 2023 Oscars, but rather the 2021, almost 6 years ago. And obviously the reason I'm reviewing it is that it would feel weird to review the sequel without reviewing the original. Anyway, with that said, let me work backwards and explain the conclusion first, and then show how everything fits perfectly together. Basically, there's this nurse called Marta who works for this very wealthy author. She has to give him a small amount of morphine and a larger amount of some other drug. She believes that one night she accidentally mixed up the doses, and recognizing it as an honest mistake, this man decides to fake a suicide to exonerate her. However, it turns out that previously, this man had told his rebellious, washed-up grandson that he's being cut out of the inheritance, and that it was all being left to Marta. So the grandson, Ransom, played by Chris Evans, switches the medicines in the hopes of making it seem that Marta accidentally killed him, but it would be enough to invalidate her claim to the will. So basically it was attempted murder, which then was negated by Marta's apparent mistake, but then it became, I guess, felony murder, when based on this misbelief he was going to die anyway, his granddad killed himself. That is pretty much the solution to the murder, but what's fantastic is all the extra nuances to it. I mean, just as a case in point, I thought it seemed a little bit dumb that this nurse wouldn't have checked the vials before administering them, because the reason she mixes them up is that they get knocked over, but if they're knocked over, check you didn't mix them up. However, the detective, Blanc, played by Daniel Craig, contends that the reason she didn't check is that she can tell the subtle difference between the two liquids without having to check the label, so she knew which one to give him, which is why she didn't check the labels.
It's just little things like that which I love, where it wouldn't be a film-destroying plot hole for this nurse to just forget to check the label, but even still, there's this effort to actually explain it in a way that makes perfect sense. Films like this are what makes people massive jerks who say, plot holes don't matter, because what you're essentially saying is, a film being consistent and a plot progressing logically doesn't matter, and as such, by extension you're saying, there is no value added to a film when a talented screenwriter makes the effort to write a plot that makes sense. Well, guess what? This film has a plot that makes perfect sense, and that makes the overall film absolutely fantastic, because the talent on display just blows my mind. I could go through every little thing that was introduced earlier and explained with this revelation, but I think my favourite example of the complexity working perfectly is the toxicology report. See, Marta gets a letter containing the header of a toxicology report, which she obviously thinks must show that the grandfather died from the morphine overdose she gave him. However, it turns out that actually, the housekeeper saw Ransom fiddling with the vials, so she concludes there must be something incriminating in the toxicology report. So she finds the toxicology report, not knowing what any of it means, but assuming it must incriminate Ransom, so she sends a photocopy of the header to him with a plan to meet up and blackmail him. However, Ransom knows that Marta still thinks she gave him the wrong dose, so he sends it on to her with a meeting time set for 2 hours later in the day. Meanwhile, he then commits an arson attack on the toxicology department and shows up to the meeting with the housekeeper at the appointed time to murder her so that Marta will find her dead body. The only confusing thing is that they say that the morphine overdose kills you in just 10 minutes, but the housekeeper survives for 2 hours in order to just reveal a small amount of information to Marta before passing out, and Marta informs us later on that she survived at the hospital. That is, as far as I can tell, the only substantial plot hole in the movie, and yeah, the movie would be better without that. But yeah, even after all this, Ransom is like, well, you've got nothing to actually incriminate me except attempted murder, which is way less serious than actual murder, so screw you. This, however, is when we find out from Marta that she was lying. The housekeeper did in fact die, and therefore Ransom just confessed to her murder. So yeah, everything is wrapped up in a neat little package, I guess. But of course, it might not sound as impressive when I just tell you the film features all these mysteries and reveals. What makes a film really impressive is when you don't see these reveals coming, and don't even consider what's a mystery until it's revealed to be as such. Despite the fact that I started this off by saying that my initial assumption in this film was that they were all responsible, I haven't yet revealed more than one part of who they all are. Because what I'm referring to there is all of the author's progeny who could expect to inherit his fortune. So a lot of the film is showing us all these various characters with all their unique idiosyncrasies, priorities, and grievances against the deceased. There's not too much point getting into specifics, but essentially, they're all exactly what you'd expect. Rich, entitled snobs who all seem to be to varying degrees hated by their father/grandfather, who is actually a self-made man. With this said, they are especially annoyed when it's revealed that Marta has been named the sole heir in the will, and they all show their true colours in terms of how self-serving and bigoted they are. So much so that when Marta is about to confess, Blanc chastises the family and takes her to one side to tell her not to confess, as there are still many unanswered questions. And that's when we get the reveal that she didn't actually give him the wrong medication at all. There is a bit of politics in this movie which might strike people as on the nose, some very unsubtle conversations about immigration and alt-right trolls. But to anyone who wants to argue that this movie has some sort of political agenda, I just point out that half the family are identified literally as SJWs, and they're also presented to be massive dickheads who don't care about anyone other than themselves. So I think the point of the politics is just to say the main issue of these people isn't their politics, but their personalities, which are awful. With this said, what's interesting about Chris Evans is that he seems to be the only guy who's pretty chill and doesn't actually care about the money. He also seems to really care about Marta. Of course, in reality, he only doesn't care about the money because he already knew about all this, and he only cares about Marta because he needs to work out how to put together his plan to incriminate her. But yeah, that's what makes this film so entertaining. Because it's an investigation with interviews and fact-finding, we get to find out a whole load of information about this family that keeps you guessing what the eventual reveal will be. I suppose I should say, of course, that Daniel Craig is really entertaining as the eccentric detective Benoit Blanc. The whole thing is just so goofy, but in a way that works perfectly. He has this really funny way of talking that just screams good old-fashioned murder mystery. It is kind of funny watching them solve a murder that we actually know the basic solution to. Indeed, at first, it didn't even make sense to me why they cover all this up. It was an honest mistake, and the initial excuse of her mother being an illegal immigrant so any police scrutiny around them would be bad makes no sense because, well, there was clearly some police scrutiny. But yeah, obviously he knew he was leaving her all his money, so that's why he didn't want there to even be any suspicion of foul play, so he instructs Marta on how to cover her tracks. But this is difficult because of the one final thing about Marta that I think really adds something to this film. Marta is incapable of lying. Specifically, she has a strong gag reflex such that any time she lies, she ends up throwing up. Obviously, this plays a significant role in the film, but I just really like the idea of a murder mystery featuring a main character who is incapable of lying. That's just a really original concept to throw into the mix. And overall, this comes together to make the film, in my view, totally fantastic. It's a really interesting mystery with a lot of strange characters and novel notions. The only downside is that in being a mystery, it doesn't have as much rewatch value, because a lot of what makes it great is the reveal of finding out how it all went down. However, God willing, I'll forget the plot again at some point, and I'll be able to return back to it in another 6 years. I think this time, having written a full review about it, it will probably stay with me. Yeah, I think this film is just really, really solid. Really well written. The best murder mystery I've ever seen. I'm torn between a high 8 and a low 9. But just because there's not much to get out of repeated watches, I'll keep it stuck at a high 8. Still incredibly good though. So next I watched Glass Onion, and I have to say, wow, that was a significant downgrade. Not just relative to the first film, but also within the film itself. It starts off so much better than it ends up. So the initial mystery is that 6 people receive a mysterious box that, when solved, reveals that they've been invited to the island of this eccentric billionaire called Miles. 5 of these people are his close associates who know him well. In fact, they all in some way owe their success to his patronage, except for one of them, who was in fact screwed over by him. As you'd expect, though, they all have, in some sense, a complicated and difficult relationship with him, and all have an incentive to murder him, either for revenge, or because he might help them advance further. Oh, and I should mention that the reason they've been invited to this private island is to take part in a murder mystery solving his murder. But as it happens, the 6th person to receive an invitation was our old familiar detective Blanc from the previous film. Also, this film is set during COVID, and there's some social distancing and mask stuff at the beginning, but then once they're on the island, this doesn't really factor into anything at all. This film would be unchanged if it was set at some other time. Except for one bit of characterization where this woman is wearing a fishnet face mask that is clearly just a pointless fashion accessory. But here's where it gets interesting. Miles pulls Blanc aside and asks him, "Hey, quick question, what are you doing here?" It turns out that Miles did not invite Blanc, and that this seems to be in keeping with what might be a defining part of this Knives Out series, Blanc being invited to investigate a mystery, while the person who invited him itself remains a mystery. At this point, I was so excited that I immediately ran into the other room to tell my wife about the mystery, because I was so excited to see where it was going. I think what I like is that this was a totally unexpected twist in the tale for me. The first big twist. The obvious assumption would be that this billionaire has invited the world's greatest detective because he wants to prove how great this murder mystery he's constructed is. So when you find out actually he's been invited by someone else, you're expecting a satisfying explanation, just like we got in the previous film, to who hired Blanc. Now, despite the fact he wasn't invited, Miles is so excited to have him here trying to solve the mystery, at least he is until Blanc effortlessly solves the entire mystery before the murder has even taken place. He's already worked out how the murder is going to happen, the motive and the culprit. So at this point, I'm liking everything about this movie. It's even better than the first, and I'm so excited to see all these mysteries build up to an interesting solution. And then one of the people dies. Although at first I thought maybe this would be like another attempt at a fake crime to solve, but no, he actually dies. I thought someone might even get beheaded because they keep focusing on this automatic door that snaps shut to protect the Mona Lisa from damage, which Miles is currently loaning out since the Louvre is closed for lockdown. Oh, I guess the fact COVID is happening does have slightly more relevance now I think about it. But instead he's just poisoned on a drink, whatever. Shortly after that, the woman who was screwed over by Miles, Andy, also gets shot. And this is when the film gets bad, because we then get a really protracted flashback where the film just sort of shows us the answers to most of the mystery without any investigation whatsoever. Basically, we find out through flashbacks that actually Andy was already dead, and the woman who is pretending to be Andy is her twin sister, and she hired Blanc to his face, and they both agreed to him pretending a mysterious person invited him on the island. All they've been doing is hanging out on the island trying to work out who is responsible for Andy's death, and none of what has happened so far really matters. Oh, and it turns out that Andy, or whatever her sister's name is, didn't actually die when she got shot, lucky her, and thus she's able to actually evidence that Miles stole his most successful idea from Andy. And at this point, it's pretty easy for Blanc to surmise that Miles killed Andy, and he killed the other guy because it was set up earlier. That guy gets constant notifications on his phone, so as soon as it was revealed that Andy is dead, Miles then kills him to cover his tracks. And that's it, that's the mystery fully revealed, and obviously it's pretty disappointing. Mostly because there isn't an investigation. There isn't any sense that stuff we found out throughout the runtime of the film, and twists and turns that have been revealed, actually amount to anything. The biggest issue is that the mystery entirely hinges on stuff that Blanc already knew about from the start of the film that we the audience just weren't shown, which sort of removes the fun of actually watching him be a detective. The great thing about the first film is you could watch the entire film from Blanc's perspective and it would work perfectly. But if you watch this film from Blanc's perspective, then the central mystery of the island doesn't matter, and the actual mystery was already solved before he even arrived. There's a titular metaphor for this film, the glass onion. I didn't know this was the meaning of the term, I just thought it was like a nonsense phrase that the Beatles made up, but apparently the point of the metaphor was that while onions are layered, a glass onion would be transparent. It's a mystery that seems deep and complex, but is in fact totally clear. The thing is, any bigger Beatles nerd than me would immediately pick up on this metaphor, and that makes this not a revelation at all. And more to the point, this idea of a really complicated conspiracy that's actually revealed to be incredibly simple was already done much better by Hot Fuzz. There's this moment where Blanc reveals that they're all treating this like some big complicated situation, but really, Miles is just a total idiot. But to me, that was already obvious. He already seemed like an idiot from the start, so this doesn't work as a twist. I mean, I guess the point is supposed to be that the mystery was trivially easy to solve, because it was ultimately based on the actions of a stupid guy who just acts impulsively, but that's not interesting. It also annoys me that there wasn't any deep characterization here. I mentioned these special puzzle boxes they get at the start. What I didn't mention is that Andy's sister actually just smashes the box instead of solving the puzzle. At the time I thought, oh, that's interesting. This shows that Andy is probably the kind of person who doesn't have time for Miles' eccentric bullshit. That's a really good way of showing that. But it turns out actually it was just her sister doing that because she has no frame of reference for what this box even is. Also, I found it interesting that Blanc seemed a bit awkward and buffoonish in this, and thought that was a fun part of his character. But I think it was just him trying to throw people off from what he was investigating at a deeper level. Anyway, by the end of the film I was just thinking, there better be some big clever twist coming up here. Something that makes me think, oh wow, some interesting stuff that was set up actually got paid off. But no. Instead, Miles just burns the proof that he stole Andy's idea, so her sister just trashes the house, and because he lost all his wealth, the people who were dependent on him no longer have a reason to back him up. So they all just agree to tell the truth about what a bad person he is. It is a bit weird tonally because, like, he murdered 2 people. 2 human beings are dead because of him, but the conclusion is just this epic girl boss moment where she trashes all his stuff like she got broken up with in a music video. With Chris Evans' character in the previous film, the fact he was actually a murderer had a lot of weight to it. But here it just felt like, tee-hee, get wrecked, loser. The main way she bankrupts him is by destroying the Mona Lisa, which he had on loan, and I guess destroying a priceless artifact would bankrupt anyone, but at the same time, she also did just destroy the most important part of human heritage, and everyone's just chill about it? I mean, that's a pretty bad thing to do. There's also this whole thing about this new fuel he invented that is apparently pretty dangerous, and that's why his house blows up. It doesn't really matter. I mean, goodness me, what a downgrade. The biggest issue is having a mystery where the main character actually knew all the answers from the start, so you don't get any satisfaction from just seeing it unfold. And I'm left unsatisfied. I'm trying to consider what to rate this with a mind towards the fact it might still technically be a good film, just so much worse than the previous one, which I rated a high 8. But if this was the first film and I didn't have a standard to judge it by, would I say it's still terrible? Might I get more out of it if I just watched it a second time? Maybe the fact the mystery is so unimpressive means the film gets better when you're not thinking about the mystery. For now, I'll give this a low 6. If I rewatch it at some point and think it's even worse, I'll go down to a 5. I can't imagine a rewatch could possibly elevate this to a 7. Anyway, I'm going to now watch the 3rd movie in the series. I did hold off on this until it was clear it wasn't getting any nominations this year, and yeah, it isn't. I'm not going to review it properly, but since I'm here, low 7. Positives are that there's an interesting hook with a seemingly impossible murder, where a guy gets stabbed in a locked room. Also, there's some buried treasure, which is delightfully cliche for a mystery. And finally, there's this whole religious thing with this guy faking his own death and then a resurrection. The negatives are that this whole religious thing leads into a politics thing, which is more overbearing. I feel like these movies have got increasingly political, and the number of right-wing political provocateurs is getting annoying. Also, in general with the religious thing, it's weird that it's set in a Catholic church, but in terms of church culture, everything about this seems evangelical, so I don't get why they're Catholic. Also, while this murder is complicated, I solved it pretty immediately, which isn't a good sign because I'm not that smart. Spoiler alert, but the question is, how was the priest stabbed in a closed room if they can only prove move, a remote control signal was sent after he collapsed, and a remote control is the only explanation. Really not difficult. The priest collapsed, presumably due to being poisoned or something, and then he was stabbed by some kind of remote control afterwards. And yeah, that's basically what happened. I got that immediately. Overall, it's just missing that intricately constructed mystery with so many different threads coming perfectly together that was present in the first movie, and I guess must have simply been lightning in a bottle. Next, I watched Elvis. So the thing about this movie you have to ask is whether it's just as boring and trope-filled as every other musical biopic, and biopic in general. I had a friend say no, because what's unique about this movie is it's so frenetic and over the top with its shots and editing that it simulates the craziness of Elvis's life, and that makes it exciting. But my issue is that this still does the classic biopic thing of blasting through Elvis's life so quickly that it at times barely has a story at all and ends up feeling like a Wikipedia article. Like, the plot of the movie is Elvis was a kid who liked black people music, then one time he appeared on stage and his rhythmic hips made the girls go wild, so he got popular doing that, then the establishment said he had to stop doing that, but he did it anyway, then he became rich and got a mansion, then he started spending lots of money and having personal issues. I could go on, but the point is there was so many moments where I just felt like I didn't really know Elvis at all as a character because we're just seeing things happen to him. And yes, you could say that the crazy editing and fast pace symbolizes Elvis's meteoric rise, but considering how many musical biopics do just recount the entire story of somebody's life without actually building a properly paced narrative, I can't see the fast pace as anything other than an excuse to do the same. Likewise, for the fact this whole story is told from the perspective of Colonel Parker, or Andreas Van Racial Slur for Jewish People. Basically, this guy was Elvis's manager, and he's the narrator, and he's telling us all about Elvis. The gigantic, massive problem is that this isn't actually a story about Colonel Parker. It's a story about Elvis, just told from the perspective of Colonel Parker. So we're just further removed from the perspective of who this story is actually about. And Colonel Parker serves as narrator for this movie, which makes the opportunities for tell, don't show so numerous that, again, this doesn't actually feel like a movie. We're in prime Wikipedia summary territory. And I guess the other big thing with this not being a story is that it's not really clear what this movie is ultimately about. Like, the obvious answer would be that this is about Elvis being controlled and financially exploited by his manager. We're shown that he was the one who drugged Elvis up to force him to take to the stage even when exhausted. The problem is that actually, we're not shown Parker having much control over Elvis at all. Instead, the movie is just a constant cycle of Parker telling Elvis to do something, Elvis going along with it, then eventually getting frustrated and doing something rebellious that ignores him, and then Parker convincing him to come back with another way of making money. It sort of makes Parker seem like an impotent loser. He'll be like, now Elvis, don't you do any of that wiggling dancing. And then Elvis does it anyway and he's like, by God, that boy didn't listen to me. He also seems to be terrible at business in that he constantly resists any controversy whatsoever. Like, he pushes Elvis to have absolutely no personality, and Elvis has to rebel against him to have any stage presence whatsoever. The only time I was on Parker's side was when at a Christmas show, Elvis was going to rebel and not sing any Christmas songs. I mean, sorry, but if I tuned into a Christmas show as a viewer, I would expect Christmas songs rather than rock and or roll. We're told that Parker took 50% of Elvis's money, but then somehow he's also able to charge Elvis for all of his expenses retroactively when Elvis tries to cut ties with him, which I think surely someone as famous as Elvis could have sued to avoid that. We're also told that Parker threw away all his money on gambling, so I guess Vegas got rich in the end. Well done them. Something I didn't get is that when he negotiates for Elvis to sing at a Vegas hotel, he's given as a sweetener unlimited line of credit at their casino. But doesn't that mean he can borrow as much money as he wants and never have to pay it back? So he could literally just keep taking out $10 million, putting it on roulette, and eventually he'll win, so free money glitch. Like, offering unlimited access works with something like beer or food because there's a limited amount somebody can actually consume, but there's no limit to how much money you can gamble. You could just be like, I bet $1 trillion on red, and then bankrupt the casino. Or if they say, no, that's your limit, you can sue them for breach of contract. Whatever, here's another thing that confused me about Parker and Elvis's relationship. A huge focus is put on the fact that Elvis wants to perform internationally, and Parker keeping Elvis at the casino is shown as a contradiction of that. So we're to understand that Parker keeping Elvis at the casino instead of going off on his world tour is bad and holding Elvis back, especially since his actual reason for this is that Parker doesn't have a passport or a legal right to leave the US and therefore couldn't come with him. But here's the thing, right? Parker is like, hey Elvis, what about you go on an all-American tour? 15 days, 15 cities, it'll be fun. And then we see a montage of this tour, and the film is clearly trying to show how all this is placing such a massive strain on Elvis, and it's all Parker's fault. But like, surely a world tour would have been even more stressful. I don't know, it just makes you feel like you're being manipulated when you can so easily imagine that if Elvis had gone on the world tour, you know they'd be like, and this shows how the exploitative Parker forced Elvis away from his American fanbase and isolated him in these unknown lands where he became totally drained. I guess I should say that of all the musical biopics I've seen, this most of all feels like propaganda for its subject. Like, this movie tries to portray Elvis as pretty much a complete saint. Firstly, they totally ignore any substance issues on his end of things. I swear the only time he's given drugs is when he's pretty much unconscious and Parker has them injected into him. They show him as being massively invested in the civil rights movement on a personal level, which as far as I can tell is very much exaggerated. I mean, I don't think Elvis's involvement in advocating for civil rights was significant enough to be such a big part of a 2.5-hour film about him. But obviously this is part of the wider effort to address the whole Elvis stole black music criticism, because here a big focus is put on how much Elvis loved black people. Black people loved Elvis, and Elvis was a real hero for black people. In fact, the only people who had a problem with him playing black music were the backwards white segregationists who saw him as corrupting the youth. Do you want to be like them? Do you want to be a racist who hates Elvis? They even include a small number of contemporary rap songs in the soundtrack for some key moments of Elvis swag, just to show how black people today should love Elvis because he'd be down with their music too. For the record, I don't care about this whole thing, and from my perspective, listening to Elvis and then listening to black musicians from back in the day, I actually think they sound pretty different. You know, everyone ignores that a lot of Elvis's most famous songs are slow ballads where he sounds more like a crooner than anything distinctly black. So we're going to say that Barry Manilow and Andy Williams stole black music too? Indeed, they sort of pivot the whole Elvis is a white guy who does black music, let's exploit that, onto Colonel Parker. He's the one who realizes that makes him marketable. There is one thing that the movie seems to present as a thesis statement. It's said several times in the movie, and is pretty much the last thing we're told. What really killed Elvis is his love for the audience. The problem with this is that we're never shown any evidence of this at all. There is not a single moment of the film where I would have picked up that Elvis is working himself to death out of love for his audience, except for when we're explicitly told that. Most of the movie presents his audience as total NPCs. They place a big emphasis on the crowd reacting to the applause cue during his TV performances as if they wouldn't have applauded themselves. Also, his audience itself is wildly variant. At the start, it's mostly just young girls organisming in the front row over his wiggles, while at the end, it's not really clear who his audience is at all, just random wealthy Vegas patrons, I guess. If we don't know who his audience even is by the second half of the film, how can the primary driver of Elvis's character be that he loved us, the audience, so much? He doesn't even know me. But again, clearly this is just more Elvis slopaganda. With almost all biopics, I can't help but sit back and think how it would have been better if you just told one story. In this case, I'd say if you want to tell a story about Elvis being exploited by his manager, start it in the middle of their relationship, maybe even start it at the Christmas show or something, which in this film happens at least an hour in. And then you have twice as much time to actually flesh out their relationship as you show Elvis's declining health while working at the casino, so you don't have to just tell us it. Or just make a story about Elvis as a crazy party animal, focus on his relationship with girls while he was blowing up, and then have it end with him becoming more politically conscious and end with him performing If I Can Dream. Those are two distinct films that jump out to me based on watching this, but when you try to compress the multiple stories of a single man's life into one film, it loses any impact. And the decision to tell it through this other guy's perspective with all these cuts and this super fast pace and every major development being expressed through voiceover, I really am not a fan. Indeed, for me, this is like a low 3. I mean, it has some stuff that makes it sort of okay, but on balance, it just feels like a totally forgettable movie that doesn't have any real point, and the point it ostensibly has isn't really well communicated at all. That's not good. Next, I watched Charlie Panther, Kirkanda Forever. So yeah, I think I mentioned I did in my first iteration of this endeavor last year, decide to ignore movies part of big franchises, but now we're doing this. With that said, I don't know, maybe at some point I should conclude the Oscar season with Marchville and just get all these cape shit movies out of the way. The only thing I'd maybe talk about for the first movie that might be relevant here is the world building around Wakanda. In this film we get a lot more world building, as the primary antagonists here are a different civilization that also has deposits of vibranium that give them special abilities. This is Talocan, which are Mayans. One thing I find kind of funny about this is Mesoamerica already had obsidian as a huge part of their culture, so you're telling me they get 2 resource buffs?
I will say this choice of Mayans as this oppressed group who got special powers does make the politics a bit more confusing, because for Wakanda it's pretty simple. Almost all of Africa was colonized by white people, and now there are white people and black people, and all black people call the white people colonizers. But then in the Americas it gets a bit confusing because the Latin American population have obviously been invaded and exploited by the United States at various points throughout history, and nowadays in broad terms, people typically understand Hispanics as like an oppressed, marginalized racial group. But then from the perspective of this ancient Mayan civilization that's led by this immortal guy from the 16th century, the Spanish settlers would be the most evil people. I guess all I'm thinking is I'd want to see a scene where one of the Talican walks up to a Latina democratic socialist like AOC and calls her a colonizer. And it's a bit awkward because in contemporary politics, only white Anglo-Saxons are colonizers. Get it right? Anyway, so these underwater Mayans. What is there to say about them? I mean, honestly, I just really do not care. There's such a strong sense that these people don't matter in the grand scheme of things. Also, the whole conflict makes no sense. And that's a bit of a bad thing for a movie, because essentially the Talican want to declare war on the entire surface world, which they think they can do. Although, weirdly, they're also worried about being discovered by the surface world, with the implication being that they wouldn't be able to defend themselves, but they'd be way more effective on the offense, I guess? And then the other internal contradiction is that the first stage of their plan is that they really want the Wakandans to help with the invasion, and they're willing to go to war with the Wakandans if they don't help with the invasion. But like, if the Wakandans are so weak that you think you can totally destroy them and still be powerful enough to conquer the rest of the world, then why does it matter whether they join or not? Seems like the Talicans think they can take care of business themselves. Overall, this main antagonist for the entire film doesn't actually feel especially compelling, and as an aside, living underwater must suck. Wakanda sort of seems like a utopia, whereas here I just feel grossed out imagining how cold and wet and dark it would be. Almost every single character thing in this film just feels pointless and like it didn't lead to much. This general lady takes Shuri on a mission and then they get ambushed by bad guys, Shuri gets captured and the general gets demoted. She's really sad about it, but then the next time we see her, she is being reappointed. Martin Freeman is back, but all that happens is he offers some vague help to the Wakandans, is arrested for leaking state secrets, and then in the end he's rescued as like an epilogue of sorts. Oh wait, I just realized I didn't watch the end credits scene. Let me see what's going on there. Alright, T'Challa has a son, and there's a vague teaser of Doctor Doom in the future. Cool. Speaking of Doctor Doom, there's also a new girl version of Iron Man. The thing is, she hardly has any personality at all, nor would the film be especially different if she didn't even exist. Also, there's one moment where she kills someone with her Iron Man suit, and I was thinking, these films really like to pretend that the capacity to kill someone automatically entails the emotional willingness to do it. Like, this girl has rockets that can blow people up, so boom, time to create some widows and orphans and not think anything about it. No PTSD, no strong sense of sadness about it. And of course, I should say that Shuri herself, who ends up being the titular Black Panther, doesn't really have a character arc. There's a bit earlier on where she's resistant to making the flower that brings back the Black Panther because she cares more about technology, and also I think she doesn't want her brother's memory to be replaced. However, when it becomes clear they need a competitive advantage, she does produce a new flower and become the new Black Panther. But this seems to be less about emotional growth and much more about necessity. And when she has her little Black Panther vision, she envisions Killmonger from the first film, but she didn't really have any relationship with him at all, so the whole thing seems totally meaningless. The main point of it seems to be that Killmonger was seeking revenge for his father being murdered, and at this point Shuri's brother and mother have both been killed. But the main thing that made Killmonger a villain is that he wanted to start a violent insurgency across the entire world, leading to the deaths of millions of people. Shuri has never shown any interest in waging a violent war of expansion, and on the contrary, has literally just revived the Black Panther for the singular reason of stopping the villain from launching a war of conquest himself. Oh, also, this film literally does the meme of, if I kill him, I'll be just as bad as him, even after these people have killed many nameless henchmen. But I do get that this guy is at her mercy, so it would be a bit weird if she killed him. Speaking of killed, I guess the main thing that hangs over this movie is that Chadwick Boseman dies, and as such, this universe presents T'Challa as dying from some unexplained illness 5 years or so after the first film. This film therefore shows us his funeral, and also the Marvel logo thing at the start is all pictures of him, and then later on they do a bit of a montage where Shuri remembers T'Challa.
In some sense, the real world tragedy gives this film a bit more weight, but I'm actually not going to give the film a bonus point because one of the main stars tragically died. That would be a bit perverse. With that said, I can't be bothered to organize my points anymore, so let me just repeat the notes I haven't covered yet. There's some cool stuff where other companies are conducting espionage missions to try to steal their vibranium, but this is just at the start and doesn't really lead anywhere. It doesn't really make sense to me that the Wakandans would be super skilled at driving modern American cars, but whatever, I guess they just train for that. It's pretty embarrassing for the Taliban that they have to flood everywhere they attack before they can be at all effective. It also doesn't make sense they have all these strategies for attacking when they've been isolationists for so long. Also, the fact that one of their powers is just the ability to hypnotize people and cause them to kill themselves, that seems pretty damn overpowered actually. Like they could really have put that to better use. I don't understand why the Wakandans don't tell the rest of the world about the Taliban so they can all team up against them. Initially, they're told not to tell anyone because Shuri is being held hostage, but once she's rescued, there's nothing stopping them. I also wrote, what the hell kind of relationship is this? This is stupid. I don't actually remember what I wrote that about, honestly. I think I would have written it about the Killmonger conversation, actually. Now I'm thinking about it. That would make the most sense, because I was genuinely thinking, what the hell kind of relationship does Shuri have with Killmonger? They don't really have one. Anyway, that's the end. Overall, this film is, I guess, technically fine, but because it's an action movie, fine makes it just feel boring, which is kind of the worst thing it could be. Nothing really to make the film stand out is especially worth watching. Probably like a high 3 out of 10. Okay, so this wasn't actually my original plan, but just for the sake of comparing like with like, let's jump over to DC and talk about The Batman. Yeah, so The Batman is such an insanely boring movie. I've seen it twice now, and I wish I had seen it 0 times because it's not worth my time. Here's just one concrete example of how this movie is worse than any other Batman media. In Batman the Animated Series, there's this recurring cop character who is very opposed to Batman because he's a vigilante. He doesn't trust him, and he always assumes the worst of him. This character is a very good, very loyal cop with a keen sense of right and wrong and justice, and he believes in the system. The lesson there is a nuanced one, that even though Batman and this cop disagree about methods and are often working in opposition to each other, they both ultimately want what's best in their eyes. So tell me how it is that a cartoon show for children is more morally nuanced and sophisticated in terms of its characterization than this supposedly more adult, realistic version of the character. Because here, every single cop that is critical of Batman turns out to be corrupt. They don't like our based caped crusader, so obviously they must be wholly bad people. Moral nuance? Who cares? I feel like this film was made for people who think dark and gritty automatically translates to artistic and mature. I don't think this film is that at all. Indeed, the darkness of this film at some points approaches self-parody in my estimation. The best example of this is how Commissioner Gordon and Batman both talk exactly the same. When I first watched this movie, it was with my wife. She wouldn't have ever agreed to watch this a second time, and the only joy we got from it was laughing at how unintentionally comedic conversations between these two were. Looks like the Riddler is back at it again. This guy's one sick puppy, man. This whole city is one sick city. There was times I literally felt like I was watching a YouTube skit, like those Pete Holmes sketches that were parodying the Nolan Batman movies. This film is literally beyond parody. There is no amount of ridiculousness you could add to this that would go beyond what's already present. So yeah, for me, the way this film insists on being so dark is worthy of derision. Never mind the fact it's certainly not worthy of being praised in itself, but that seems to be the only thing this film has going for it. Even Alfred just feels like so much more of a miserable person in these movies, and to me, that means he just doesn't stand out as much of a character. He just lurks in the background, looking miserable. The only thing I do like is he's a bit more active in helping with the detective work. That's nice. But yeah, there's just no element of fun or levity to these films that were absolutely present in every other version of Batman. And that's because Batman himself is boring. Or more to the point, Bruce Wayne is boring. Something I love about superheroes is the alter ego aspect. You know, mild-mannered billionaire socialite Bruce Wayne is actually the masked crime fighter Batman. I'm sorry, but nobody has exceeded the quality of the Tim Burton movies where the Batman-Bruce dichotomy is in full effect. But even in the Nolan films, there's this sense that Bruce is a different person from Batman, and there's intrigue in that. Here, it's just unrelenting misery, as we almost never see Batman being Bruce Wayne, and when we do, he's still being just as miserable as ever. There are logical issues with this, like it makes it way easier to guess that Bruce Wayne is actually
actually Batman if he already looks like a crazy maladjusted hermit, wouldn't be hard to imagine that he's the crazy guy running around in the Batsuit. I do like the idea of Batman as scary. I like some of the action scenes and how proficiently he takes down criminals, but the point is supposed to be the contrast. Isn't that the whole point of superhero movies in general? They're about transformation and stuff. But no, here, Bruce Wayne has no character, might as well not exist, and as such, we are just left watching an emo in a suit mumbling to himself. I will grant there is some point to this. At one point, the Riddler says that Batman is the real person and implies that he puts on a mask whenever he stops being Batman. I definitely agree with that assessment. Batman seems a lot more real than Bruce Wayne does. I've also heard people say the point of this movie is supposed to be that Batman becomes Bruce Wayne at the end, and as such this is a journey of discovery, so he can't be Bruce Wayne at the start. Alright, fair enough. But there being some reason for what happens in a film should be a basic hurdle to clear. I get that there's a point to why Batman is so miserable and boring, but he's still miserable and boring, and why would I want to just be miserable and bored for 3 hours? Speaking of miserable and bored, I also have very little enthusiasm for the villain here, the Riddler. Okay, let me start with some compliments. I do think the idea of a serial killer who taunts Batman with clues is an interesting idea, and for the most part the film delivers on that potential with some interesting challenges. There we go, that's a compliment. Now, time for the criticisms. Firstly, I think the Riddler's motivations are kind of stupid. Like, he seems to just be exposing corrupt politicians, but it's not really clear why. And then he randomly decides to also attack Bruce Wayne because his dad had a random journalist murdered 20 years ago in an effort to cover up something totally unrelated to the central conspiracy of the movie. The whole thing just seems totally unrelated, and I can't help but think, how many other crimes from several decades ago would he now be taking out on the children of the perpetrators if he'd been allowed to get away with it? And then at the end of the film, he decides he just wants to flood the entire city because he's just mad, I guess. He thinks it's corrupt. Considering this guy loves riddles and clues, you'd think his motivation would be a little bit more complicated than corruption exists, so I'm just going to kill everyone. There also aren't that many standout moments where he defines himself as a character. Honestly, he feels a lot more like the Heath Ledger Joker, right down to intentionally getting caught. Although in this case, there's no real reason why he intentionally gets caught. But honestly, Jim Carrey's Riddler was more interesting than this. At least he had like an origin and he felt really unique. I don't want to go full Quentin Tarantino here because I think Paul Dano is a good actor, but they just didn't give him any big moments to actually shine, and they didn't write any fantastic standout lines for him. I genuinely can't think of a single live-action Batman villain who's left less of an impression with me. When he flooded the entire city, randomly Jack Nicholson's line entered my head, "This town needs an enema," and then he blows a party horn. Because I was just thinking, man, remember villains who actually had memorable personalities? Considering how utterly dull this guy is, I just can't get my head around the fact that somehow he was able to recruit a load of other people to all dress up as him and start some sort of armed insurrection. Who cares? It doesn't really make sense to me that the corruption that's being exposed here would even matter to most people. Like, yeah, it's bad if the police are corrupt, but there's no indication it's affecting people's wallets, so I don't know why the average person would care. But either way, this means the end of the film is profoundly anticlimactic. The villain is already arrested, so Batman just has to defeat these random LARPers who shouldn't really present any problem for him at all, so he does defeat them, and boom, it's over. I did like the whole idea that the Riddler thought he and Batman were working together because he's the brains who finds out all the info, and then Batman's the brawn who, by following the clues, brings justice to light. That was slightly interesting, but that's it. And yeah, that's most of the plot, so overall I was left unimpressed. There wasn't some grand conspiracy that was super interesting, weren't any big villain moments. Honestly, I have no idea how this movie actually managed to be 3 hours long because it felt like not much happened at all. This is worse than Black Panther Wakanda Forever. Yep. This gets beaten by late-stage Marvel. That's how bad it is. Just utterly boring, joyless, and a total waste of time. Low 3 out of 10. Next, and finally for this part, I watched The Fabelmans, which is a loose but seemingly pretty accurate biopic of Steven Spielberg's life, albeit with some of the character names changed. I say of his life, of his childhood, because the rest of what matters is presumably captured in behind-the-scenes footage. Anyway, I quite like this movie. Weirdly, it made me feel sad, but I think that's because, I wouldn't mind being a filmmaker myself. Like, it's not a burning passion of mine, but sometimes I think, man, that would be a really fun job. So watching a movie about this kid following his dreams and then sitting down at 30 years old in my little office and just typing out a script to a video, which
I know not that many people are going to watch. It just gives me a moment of, maybe I should have done something different with my life. But existential crisis aside, I'll just say some things I liked about this movie. Firstly, I liked all the stuff about him making his little home movies. There are some really fun moments with practical effects, where we see all the things he did to create the final result. On that note, this movie also has a really fun cameo of David Lynch playing John Ford. He delivers some very cryptic advice, and that's pretty much how the movie ends. For me, movies about making movies are always slightly entertaining on a meta level, so that elevates it, especially since he's using analog technology and editing the movies by hand. Imagine doing YouTube back in those days. The other thing I really liked about this movie is the characterization of Spielberg's dad, and interestingly, that is a Paul Dano performance. I just think the dad was characterized in this really interesting way. Like, I felt like I had a really strong sense of who he was, the subtle nuances of his personality, and I could absolutely believe he's based off a real character. Just one small example of this is there's a moment where somebody's telling a story and his daughter asks the dad, is he lying? And the dad responds, he's not lying, he's telling a story. I don't know, there's something about it that just stood out to me. It's such a direct, logical way of pointing out the nuances of human communication. The dad is an engineer, and he relates a lot of things to engineering, especially his son's movies, which he says are ultimately about solving problems in the same way engineering is. His character is made more evident through his relationship with the mum, and I'll just describe her a bit. She's clearly like BPD or something. She's constantly behaving erratically, overreacting to minor things, and also she's cheating on the dad. I interpret this as her being firstly a bit of a narcissist and also having this escapist tendency where she doesn't want to confront reality. But yeah, the affair is the big part of her character, so as you can imagine that overlaps with the dad's character. The consensus from pretty much everyone seems to be the dad is too perfect. Her daughter says that it's hard for mum because dad is so much smarter than her, and that's why she's drawn to this other guy Benny because he's a lot less serious. By the way, Benny is the dad's best friend, which is unfortunate. The mum herself says that their dad is too kind, and she finds this suffocating because, I can sort of see the logic there, even if I do have to imagine myself being a bit crazy. I guess because she has sad things going on in her life, it could annoy her that she has a husband that she doesn't really have any cause to complain about, which makes her feel unjustified in being sad, which then causes her to behave in a self-destructive way. That's my analysis. By the way, the point is the fact I can come up with a whole psychological profile on these two characters shows how well characterized they are, and I really like that. As he becomes a teenager, we get to see more of his time at school. There's not too much to this. He gets bullied for being Jewish. This is why you always have a goy name prepared so you don't get caught out. They end up calling him Bagel Man. Classic. He gets in a pretty underdeveloped relationship with this girl, and then at the end of the year, he shows a movie he made for school, and it ends up making one of the guys who bullied him seem pretty cool. So he confronts him like, hey, why did you make me look cool when I'm an arsehole to you? And he ends up sort of becoming his buddy based on that. Be kind to your enemies. I think there was that one guy who said that was a good thing to do. Not that Bagelman would know anything about that. Just kidding, I know the Old Testament says to love your enemies too, I'm just being a funny guy. Considering the time he's at school probably takes up a relatively small proportion of the movie, it's kind of crazy how much of it I remember. It's funny, I can never quite understand how it is that some movies make me feel like I've experienced years worth of stuff with a character, and then I get to the end of even longer movies feeling like pretty much nothing happened. Okay, weirdly having said that, I've now sort of run out of things to say, even though I think I've been talking about this for less time than other movies, but I think that's a compliment, because while I can describe all the things that happen in the movie, they do all build up to a singular, completed whole, so just by describing the movie in broad terms, it gives you a full picture of what it's about. It's about coming of age, about loving and making movies, about his relationship with his parents, and it's really good at being about those things. The only thing I haven't mentioned, but is strange to me, is at the start of the movie, for some reason, he's really scared of this movie that shows a train crash, and his fear about this is his entire reason for making movies. He films a model train crash over and over again, so he can watch it until it stops being scary. I'm sorry, but there has never been a moment in my life where I've been scared by a train crash. The first thing I remember seeing that scared me as a kid was like Mars Attacks, and that was about aliens murdering people with laser guns. That's actually scary. It's not even like we see him riding a train at all in this movie. America doesn't have trains. Is a train crash really so scary that you're having nightmares about it? Like, uh-oh, what if I end up on a train that's crashing? It's fine, I'm not really mad. It just seems weird to me that the movie tries to sell us on this kid being scared of this scene in the movie and that being the first thing we really find out about him, when it's obviously not a legitimate thing to be scared of at all. Anyway, overall, a very solid movie. Absolutely did not feel its length at 2.5 hours. Having said that, it's not some groundbreaking piece of fiction, hardly transcendent or anything like that. If I were to translate my feelings into a rating, a middling 7 out of 10. Anyway, everyone, that's the end of that video, so we're going to be looking at some other videos next week. I hope you enjoyed, and I didn't script the outro, so goodbye.